The wild only needs one bad decision to turn deadly, and the people in this episode made exactly that mistake. Hi, it's Christopher, and in today's episode, I'm looking at the most stupid animal attacks ever recorded. From a college student who got inches away from a king cobra for a photo in a crowded marketplace, to a man who ignored dangerous waters on a first date, trying to look fearless and paid for it in the worst way possible. It was Friday, July 5th, 2018, in Tucson, Arizona. The sun was setting over the desert and the air was very hot. Inside a small apartment, the air conditioner was humming. Ashley Marco was 24 years old. She was a person who loved reptiles more than anything else. She had a TikTok account with about 3,400 followers. She spent most of her time filming her snakes. Ashley had 14 snakes in her apartment. She had ball pythons, corn snakes, and a beautiful rainbow boa. She had a tattoo on her arm of a king cobra. She called the tattoo the crown. Most of her snakes were not venomous. This means their bite would hurt, but it would not kill you, because she handled these snakes every day. She became very brave. I want to say something here. 14 snakes, and not one of them had ever seriously hurt her. That kind of track record will make anyone feel untouchable. She would hold them with her bare hands while the camera was recording. For many months, Ashley had a dream. She wanted a king cobra. This was the snake she had always wanted. King cobras are known for being highly reactive and difficult to handle safely. Finally, she found a seller. She paid $1,800 for a young male king cobra. It was about 5 feet long. Ashley was at a pool party with her friends when she got a message. The snake had arrived at her home. She was so excited that she left the party immediately. She drove home fast. She wanted to show the world her new snake. Keeping venomous snakes legally in Arizona can involve permits and local restrictions. The snake was sent to her in a box. It traveled for 18 hours. During this time, the snake was tossed around in a dark box. It was stressed from the travel. In her older videos, Ashley told her fans that you should never touch a venomous snake right after it arrives. She said they need days to calm down. But on this Friday, she did not follow her own advice. Ashley did not have an emergency plan. She only had her phone and her ring light. At 9:42 p.m., she turned on her live stream. About 61 people joined to watch. She was smiling and full of energy. She set up her phone so everyone could see the enclosure. She talked about how happy she was. Then, she opened the shipping container. As soon as the lid opened, the cobra emerged and stood up. It spread its wide hood and stayed in a defensive position. Ashley did not move back. She used a metal hook to move the snake, but she stayed very close. She told her viewers that the snake was just being spicy. In the chat, people started to get worried. They typed messages asking her to be careful. Ashley laughed it off. 61 people watching her laugh off a king cobra strike. I genuinely didn't know whether to be more stunned by the bite or by what she did right after. As she adjusted the hook and shifted her attention toward the live stream comments, the cobra rotated suddenly and struck before she could reposition safely. The cobra bit her on the base of her left thumb. Ashley jumped back and made a sharp sound. She quickly put the snake back in its cage and closed the door. She picked up a towel she had brought from the pool party and wrapped it around her hand. She looked at the camera and tried to act like it was no big deal. She laughed nervously and told the stream she had probably just been tagged. She checked the bite. It was not swelling much. She told her followers it might be a dry bite. A dry bite is when a snake bites but chooses not to use its venom. Venom is expensive for a snake to make, so they sometimes save it for their food instead of using it for defense. She continued talking to the live stream for several more minutes, trying to stay calm for her audience. At first, Ashley thought she had gotten lucky, but over the next 20 to 30 minutes, she started sweating heavily. Her jaw felt strange. Then her eyelids became difficult to keep open. This type of venom is called a neurotoxin. It attacks the nerves and tells the muscles to stop working. Her words became slow and blurry. She tried to stand up, but her legs felt like jelly. She sat back down heavily. The people watching the live stream knew something was wrong. They urged her to call 911 immediately. Ashley kept insisting she could still breathe. One viewer contacted emergency dispatch in Tucson, but nobody knew her exact apartment number. This caused a delay while responders tried to find her. On the screen, Ashley was struggling for air It felt like a heavy weight was sitting on her chest. When the paramedics finally arrived, the ring light was still on. They found Ashley on the floor. By the time she reached the hospital, she was in severe respiratory failure. Doctors placed her on a ventilator to help her breathe. Poison control specialists worked to find king cobra anti-venom from exotic animal networks and zoos. Because king cobras are from Asia, the medicine was not easy to find nearby. By the time anti-venom arrangements were underway, the venom had already caused severe respiratory paralysis. Ashley Marco died early the next morning. She was 24 years old. The cause of death was recorded as fatal neurotoxic envenomation. The next day, wildlife authorities came to the apartment. They took the king cobra and the other snakes away. Investigators later examined whether she had the required permits and authorizations to keep the cobra. Footage of the incident was removed to discourage people from doing such stunts. It was May 18th, 2018. Gansby, Western Cape, South Africa. A shark cage diving vessel operating roughly 2 miles off a coastline, known internationally for great white shark activity. The water was cold and visibility was moderate. The operation was commercial, licensed, and running a scheduled excursion with paying participants. Theo Mercer was 31. He worked as a furniture restorer out of a small workshop in his hometown. He was good with his hands and comfortable in physical environments. He had done some recreational diving before, mostly shallow reef dives, where the wildlife was manageable and the stakes were low. He had no experience with large predatory species. People who knew him described him as someone who trusted his own judgment, confident around animals, and comfortable enough in unfamiliar situations to push at the edges of them. He had planned the trip alone. He had told friends beforehand that he wanted something closer than watching from a boat. He described the dive as a chance to finally be face to face with something real. Before entry, the crew ran a full safety briefing. The rules were printed on a laminated board mounted at the entry point. They were read aloud before anyone entered the water. One rule was given more emphasis than the others. Keep all body parts inside the cage at all times. It was repeated again just before Theo entered. He acknowledged it. He went in. The cage was functioning as designed. The barrier between the participants and the actively baited water outside it was intact. Other marine life had already made several passes during the excursion. Approximately 20 minutes into the dive, a large great white approached on a slow lateral pass. It came close, within inches of the vertical bar spacing. Close enough to see clearly, close enough to fill the space in front of the cage completely. Theo released his grip on the inner bar with one hand. He moved toward the top opening of the cage and pushed his hand and forearm out through the gap above the frame into open water, reaching slightly toward the shark as it passed. He had been around smaller reef sharks before, and nothing had happened. He carried that experience into a situation where it did not apply. I just wonder what makes him think that the shark was his friend. The great white was not a reef shark. It was not indifferent to movement in its proximity. It was a large apex predator operating in actively baited water, conditioned to associate that environment with food, and responding to a new movement stimulus the way large apex predators do. The shark reacted the moment the arm entered its space. The bite was single, rapid, and severe. Its jaw closed at close to full arm extension, with a force that left no window for withdrawal. The strike caused immediate traumatic injury to the arm, severing major vessels and causing blood loss that began at a rate the crew had no means to control. Crew members at the surface moved immediately, pulling Theo back through the cage, opening and onto the vessel. The extraction was complicated by the injury. He was out of the water within minutes, but the damage was already done. The wound was not survivable without immediate surgical intervention. The vessel was roughly 2 miles offshore. What was available on board was not sufficient for vascular trauma of that severity. Blood loss continued as the vessel made for shore. Emergency services had been contacted the moment he was back on deck. Theo Mercer died on board before the vessel reached the coast. He was 31 years old. Post-incident review confirmed that the safety briefing had been conducted in full, that the cage was intact and had performed as intended, and that the injury occurred entirely as a result of the arm being extended through the top opening of the cage into actively baited water. The single rule that had been emphasized and repeated before entry had not been followed. The operating company reviewed its protocols and made adjustments to the physical cage design to reduce the gap available at the top opening. No regulatory action was taken against the operator. It was May 12, 2018, in the forested buffer zone flanking Jim Corbett National Park in Uttarakhand, India, where the canopy pressed so thick that midday light barely reached the ground, and Langor alarm calls moved through the understory in pulses that went largely unheeded by the group. Ravi Deshmukh, 29, worked as a line cook at a mid-range hotel in Ramnagar, a town on the park's edge. Among his circle, he was the person who always had answers. Confident, unexamined, persuasive. He had no background in wildlife or chemistry. According to his friends, he had spent 2 evenings reading about commercial bear spray online, then mixed concentrated chili extract with water and rubbing alcohol, pouring it into a repurposed cologne bottle. He had concluded the capsaicin content was adequate and told his 4 companions as much, several times on the drive out. I don't think Ravi had any way of measuring the concentration of his concoction. The trip was a casual forest walk with no guide, no permits, and no particular plan. The corridor they entered is established sloth bear habitat. Sloth bears weigh between 120 and 310 pounds and carry claws up to 3 inches long. They have poor eyesight and startle at close range without warning, attacking the face and skull rather than the torso. They account for more mauling deaths in India than any other large carnivore. A forest department signboard at the trailhead warned against entry without a licensed guide and noted active bear sightings in the area. Fruiting season pulls sloth bears into peripheral zones closer to human access points. As the group approached the tree line, a farmer crossing a nearby field called out to them and gestured toward the forest. Ravi waved and kept walking. 40 minutes in, one of the group spotted movement near a cluster of bur trees. The bear was feeding roughly 80 feet out, its back to them, claws hooked into the lower branches. Ravi separated from the group and moved toward it. He closed to approximately 15 feet and pressed the nozzle on the cologne bottle. The spray came out in an uneven, low-pressure stream rather than a mist, failing to form a directed aerosol cloud and breaking apart almost immediately in midair, dispersing well short of the animal. No effective concentration of capsaicin reached the bear. The bear turned. It did not bluff or vocalize. It dropped from the branch and covered the ground in under 2 seconds. The first impact drove Ravi backward off his feet. His companions watched 30 feet behind him. According to them, the first swat pinned him flat, claws raking across his cheek and forehead. Before he could orient, the bear's jaws closed over the front of his face, teeth finding purchase around the orbital ridge and upper jaw, then releasing and rebiting in short, forceful motions. The animal remained over him, shifting its weight forward as it continued targeting the head and neck, exactly where sloth bear attacks concentrate damage. The attack stayed tight and controlled at close range, with the bear maintaining contact the entire time, adjusting its stance as Ravi's movement slowed, then ceased altogether under the sustained force. 3 of the friends ran immediately. 1, Prakash, stayed at the tree line. He could not reach Ravi and made no attempt. He later told authorities the sounds lasted approximately 4 minutes and were rhythmic and wet. The bear eventually backed off, circled twice at a low crouch, and moved into denser forest after a brief hesitation at close range before withdrawing into cover. Ravi did not move again. Prakash climbed a ridge to find mobile signal and reached emergency services. Forest rescue personnel arrived 1 hour and 12 minutes after the call, and by then it was too late. He was dead on the spot. Autopsy revealed extensive lacerations to the face, scalp, and upper chest, bilateral orbital fractures, depressed skull fracture across the frontal and left parietal regions. The cause of death was traumatic brain injury from blunt and compressive force consistent with a large animal attack. Park officials issued a brief advisory following the incident, cautioning against improvised deterrence. The cologne bottle was recovered near the site, still mostly full. This was so stupid. Ravi walked past a posted warning, dismissed a local's direct gesture, and approached a wild animal at close range holding homemade spray he had never even field tested. It was September 29, 2018, along a rainforest trail within Daintree National Park in far north Queensland, near the township of Mossman. By the time the first hiker stopped with their voice raised into the quiet canopy, the damage had already been done. Maricel Quint, known to most people as Marie, was 24 and living in Eugene, Oregon, where she worked part-time managing front desk operations at a small yoga studio while building a modest online following centered on yoga and wellness content filmed in outdoor settings. She loves bringing up the concept of being one with nature in her videos. Based on my research, she had no formal background in wildlife, no outdoor certifications, and no history of backcountry travel. Her familiarity with nature likely came from accessible viewpoints, roadside stops, and short hikes documented for social media. She had arrived in Queensland 3 days earlier on a content-focused trip planned around filming yoga sequences at scenic drives and national park landmarks. Her stated goal for the trip, based on her recent posts, was to build a set of images and clips that conveyed balance, control, and calm in remote natural landscapes. The Daintree area offered exactly that: tropical backdrops, wildlife sightings, and rainforest access points where large animals could be observed at relatively close range. Mari had rented a compact sedan in Cairns and spent her first 2 days moving between Cape Tribulation, Mossman Gorge, and several roadside viewpoints. She had seen wildlife only at a key distance: wallabies near the undergrowth, and a brief sighting of a tree kangaroo across a clearing. Understandably, I think nothing in those early encounters had required her to adjust her behavior. The trail access point where the incident occurred sat along a narrow sealed road bordered by dense tropical vegetation and intermittent clearings where animals often foraged during daylight hours. Mari reached the trailhead in the early afternoon when light foot traffic had slowed and several vehicles were already parked along the gravel verge. A southern cassowary was visible near the tree line, approximately 80 feet from the road, foraging with its head angled toward the ground. Cassowaries are widely regarded as the most dangerous birds in the world. Adult southern cassowaries stand up to 6 feet tall and can weigh between 120 and 165 pounds, with powerful legs capable of delivering forward kicks of enormous force. Each foot carries a dagger-like inner claw, the cassowary's most dangerous feature, measuring up to 5 inches in length, capable of inflicting deep lacerating wounds to the torso, limbs, or neck in a single strike. I wouldn't want to be found near one. 2 occupants in a parked hatchback remained near their vehicle, watching. Another car slowed briefly before continuing past. Mari pulled in, angled her car toward the clearing, and stopped with the driver's side facing the bird. She exited quickly, leaving the door open, her phone already in her hand with the camera active. There were visible signs that should have established distance. A permanent trailhead notice warned visitors not to approach cassowaries and to maintain a minimum distance of at least 50 feet at all times. The bird itself showed early indicators, lifting its head, raising the bright wattles at its throat, and orienting its body toward her. The couple near the hatchback later told investigators that they assumed she would stop at the edge of the verge, but instead, she stepped off the packed gravel onto uneven ground, closing the distance to roughly 60 feet. She raised her phone, seemingly adjusting her position for a tighter frame. The cassowary turned fully to face her, casque tilting slightly forward. The nearby witnesses began calling out loudly, a short, repeated signal. Mari glanced back briefly and lifted one hand in a dismissive gesture before returning her attention to the animal. She moved closer again, stepping onto a shallow slope where loose gravel transitioned to leaf litter. The distance narrowed to approximately 25 to 30 feet. The bird's posture shifted further, neck extended, body lowered slightly, legs set in a more rigid stance. It took several short, advancing steps toward her, closing a small portion of the distance, while maintaining its forward orientation. The calling increased in frequency. A passing hiker slowed and then stopped behind the couple, observing the scene. Mari adjusted her stance and raised her phone higher, positioning it as if preparing to frame herself with the cassowary behind her. It's really infuriating how she ignored all the warning signs. The charge began after a brief forward advance of several feet, the bird accelerating suddenly into a sprint. Mari reacted late, pivoting to run back toward the pavement. Her footing failed on the loose leaf litter. Her right foot slipped on the uneven slope, and she fell onto her side, impacting the ground with her shoulder and hip. She attempted to push herself upright, but the bird closed the remaining distance almost immediately. The first contact came from a forward kick, the inner claw raking across her upper abdomen and lower chest in a fast, upward motion. The force drove her flat against the ground. The impact produced a visible jolt through her body, after which her movements became less coordinated. She rolled partially onto her side, bringing her arms inward toward her head. The cassowary stepped past her and turned back toward her position, creating a brief gap of a few feet before re-engaging. The cassowary repositioned again, stepping laterally and then forward, delivering one more forceful forward kick that struck across her midsection in a broad, tearing motion. The inner claw caught briefly against her clothing and body before the leg retracted as the bird shifted its weight. The movement rotated her onto her back. Her legs extended outward without coordinated motion. Her attempts to move decreased noticeably after this point. At this point, the couple near the hatchback was shouting continuously. One was on the phone with emergency services, providing location details and reporting an active wildlife attack. The other moved closer to the road edge, waving their arms and calling out in an attempt to distract the animal. The cassowary remained focused for several seconds more, standing near her position with its head lowered, then stepped back, pivoted, and moved at a steady pace toward the tree. Line. Mari lay near the edge of the trailhead, partially on the gravel, partially on the leaf litter. There was minimal visible movement. The witnesses were instructed by emergency services to remain at a safe distance due to the risk of the cassowary returning. Considering the circumstances, I think it's commendable that they did what they could to try and save her. The call to emergency services was logged during the attack. Wildlife officers and paramedics were dispatched immediately. The first response unit arrived approximately 20 minutes after the initial call. During that interval, no one approached the victim. The cassowary did not return to the immediate area, but remained within the surrounding vegetation, according to later observation by wildlife staff. Upon arrival, responders assessed the scene for wildlife presence before approaching. Mari was unresponsive. There were multiple visible injuries across the torso and upper body. Paramedics initiated assessment procedures, but identified no signs of sustained responsiveness. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Based on the coroner's report, the cause of Mari's death was penetrating and blunt force trauma consistent with cassowary attack. Primary injuries included multiple deep lacerations to the torso, severe chest trauma, a collapsed lung, and internal hemorrhage from claw strikes. Additional trauma to the shoulder and pelvic regions was noted. The report concluded that the injuries were severe and life-threatening, with survival dependent on rapid medical intervention. The area was temporarily closed following the incident. Wildlife officers monitored the cassowary and surrounding zone for several days, noting continued normal foraging behavior consistent with established territorial patterns. No removal of the animal was carried out. Advisory signage was increased along the roadway, emphasizing minimum viewing distances and the extreme risk of approaching cassowaries under any circumstances. Mari's social media accounts were taken offline approximately 1 week later at the request of her family. Local coverage of the incident remained limited, appearing primarily in regional reports focused on wildlife safety. The trailhead where the attack occurred reopened after a brief closure, with additional warnings posted at the site. Overall, I think this was a good call, but I don't think it would stop other influencers from attempting to take selfies with a cassowary. It was June 14th, 2015, on a rented stretch of private beach outside Nassau, New Providence Island, the Bahamas, and the wedding was still in motion when something in the water changed the tone of everything happening on shore. Crispin Aldemar Voss, 31, was an HVAC technician from Asheville, North Carolina. He worked steadily, avoided attention, and followed routines. The destination wedding had been Britta's vision, and he had agreed without resistance. Britta Celine Haverkamp, 29, a dental hygienist, had spent nearly 2 years organizing the event. The photographer, Tomasz Wirecki, a Miami-based freelancer, suggested a final photo set in shallow water at sunset for lighting conditions. The resort allowed beach access without restriction. From the research I did, this kind of unrestricted shoreline access at resort properties in the Bahamas is pretty standard, and that context matters for what unfolds here. The shoreline was part of a managed coastal cove with clear, shallow water that gradually deepened into sand channels. This region is part of a wider Bahamian marine ecosystem, where coastal shark species occasionally move through reef edges, sand flats, and nearshore feeding areas while following prey movement patterns. The water was calm at the surface, with only light wave action breaking over the sandbar. Visibility was moderate, but reduced near the bottom due to stirred sediment from earlier movement in the shallows. Several guests were still waiting nearby, adding minor surface disturbance, while the couple remained stationary for photos as the photographer adjusted position closer to the waterline. Crispin stepped into chest-deep water. Britta followed, her dress floating in the current. Guests watched from the shoreline as the final poses were set. The incident occurred suddenly. Crispin's body shifted, as an unseen force from below disrupted his balance and pulled him partially underwater. The movement was abrupt enough that nearby guests initially interpreted it as a slip or loss of footing in uneven sand. He resurfaced disoriented, displacing water and struggling to orient himself before attempting to regain balance. A shark was briefly observed in close proximity in shallow water. Based on regional species presence and post-incident marine review, the most likely species involved was a bull shark, a coastal species documented in Bahamian nearshore environments and associated with severe bite incidents in shallow surf zones. Species identification could not be confirmed at the time of the incident. The interaction was consistent with a short bite and release event, a behavior documented in some coastal shark species where unfamiliar surface activity or rapid movement can trigger investigative contact rather than sustained predation. Immediately after the first contact, Crispin attempted to move toward shore but lost structural stability in the water due to injury, wave motion, and uneven footing within the sand channel. The resulting splashing and irregular movement were followed within seconds by additional close-range contact to the same lower limb, producing a more forceful injury and rapid escalation of tissue and vascular damage. Crispin remained conscious as Britta reached him. Several guests entered the water to assist, while others called for emergency help. The photographer moved toward shore as the situation escalated. Crispin was brought into shallower water by bystanders. He remained conscious for a short period, but showed rapid signs of severe blood loss from the lower body. His ability to stand collapsed as hemorrhage progressed. Britta was right there. I keep coming back to that. She was right there, and there was nothing she could do to change what was already happening. Emergency services arrived shortly after dispatch and performed hemorrhage control on scene, including a tourniquet, before rapid transport. He was airlifted to a hospital in Nassau for surgery, but died later that day from exsanguination due to severe lower limb vascular injury. Authorities classified it as a fatal marine injury during recreational shoreline activity. With no direct visual confirmation or recovered animal, the exact sequence and species could not be confirmed, though regional reviews suggested a likely interaction with a coastal bull shark. Limited footage briefly circulated before removal. The resort conducted an internal review and issued no public findings beyond standard reporting. Britta returned home days later, and the photographer left wedding work. No further statements were made. I know these kinds of incidents are rare, but they can still happen in coastal areas where humans and nearshore sharks overlap. I understand that awareness and caution in low visibility water can reduce risk, but it can't be fully eliminated. It was June 11th, 2014, out in rural Texas, and this wasn't your typical animal setup. This was part of the underground exotic animal trade, the kind of place most people don't even realize exists until something goes wrong. And I've heard about situations like this before, people thinking they can handle animals that were never meant to be handled in the first place. Cassian Roque, 38, had been running an illegal tiger breeding operation on his 20-acre property for about 3 years. He started with 2 tigers and eventually expanded to 6 adults. And somewhere along the way, he convinced himself he understood them, which, I don't know, always feels like a dangerous mindset when you're dealing with animals that weigh hundreds of pounds and are built to kill. Cassian believed in dominance, that animals respected strength, control, authority. And over time, he got comfortable, too. Comfortable walking into their enclosures like it was just part of his routine. What made things worse was how he had them set up. In one enclosure, he kept a full-grown male tiger with a female he was trying to breed. And from what I've seen, even professionals treat that kind of situation carefully, especially around feeding time, because food changes everything. On the day things went wrong, Cassian followed his usual routine. He dragged 2 deer carcasses into the enclosure and tossed them down for the tigers. Immediately, their behavior shifted. Both animals became alert, tense, focused. The male started asserting control over one carcass, while the female moved in, testing boundaries. And this is the part where most people would step back and give them space. Cassian did the opposite. He grabbed a wooden stick, something he normally used to manage them, and walked straight into the enclosure. And I keep thinking, what made him believe this would work? Every time? Because animals aren't predictable like that, especially not when food is involved. The moment he stepped in, the situation changed. The tension between the two tigers redirected. Instead of competing with each other, their attention shifted toward him. Now, he wasn't the one in control. He was the disruption. Cassian started shouting, waving the stick, trying to assert dominance the way he always had. But this time, it meant nothing. The male tiger moved first. It lunged forward with full force, knocking Cassian off balance and bringing him to the ground. Before he could react, the tiger clamped onto his neck. Almost immediately, the second tiger joined in, and at that point, there was no recovering from it. Two apex predators, already heightened by food aggression, reacting purely on instinct. There's no space for control in that situation. The attack was fast. There was no chance for Cassian to retreat, no time to reach the enclosure gate, no real way to defend himself. Within moments, the injuries were fatal, and what stands out is how quickly it all shifted from routine to irreversible in seconds. The property was isolated, with no nearby neighbors close enough to hear anything. Once the attack ended, the tigers disengaged and returned to feeding, showing no continued aggression beyond that moment. The next morning, Cassian's feed supplier arrived for a scheduled delivery. That's when the scene was discovered. Cassian's body was found near the enclosure gate he never reached. The injuries were consistent with a fatal neck bite, resulting in massive blood loss. Authorities responded by securing the property and removing all 6 tigers. The animals were transferred to accredited sanctuaries, where they were evaluated and placed under proper care without further incident. The case was ruled an accidental death caused by an exotic animal attack. Investigators cited unsafe handling practices and illegal ownership as major contributing factors. The property was later dismantled, and the incident was used by wildlife officials as a case study, highlighting the risks of keeping apex predators without proper training, facilities, or legal oversight. It was July 14th, 2016, and the endless Arctic daylight cast a flat, unbroken glow over Kaktovik's gravel shoreline along Barter Island, where scattered bowhead whale remains formed a long-established bone pile near the water's edge. The open terrain, constant daylight, and frequent presence of polar bears created a setting with little separation between human activity and a known scavenging ground. Philin Kandava, 24, had spent her life in Alaska, growing up in Utqiagvik with repeated warnings about keeping distance from polar bears. After moving to Kaktovik for part-time work, she became increasingly dismissive of those risks, often treating encounters as predictable rather than dangerous. That evening, she was drinking with friends before they walked toward the shoreline bone pile, an area known to attract bears despite the risks. I think alcohol plays a bigger role here than it might seem at first. It changes how people judge distance and danger. Polar bears are among the largest terrestrial carnivores, with adult males exceeding 1,000 pounds, though younger males typically weigh 300 to 500. Even at that size, they can move with surprising speed and coordination, and bears feeding at carcass sites are known to defend their territory or react unpredictably to disturbances. The group spotted a sub-adult male about 120 yards away, slowly moving between the whale bones and occasionally lowering its head to investigate scents left behind. One friend immediately urged them to leave, knowing how dangerous the situation could become. Philin, however, ignored the warning. Laughing, she called out toward the bear and waved her arms in exaggerated motions, interpreting the animal's brief glance as indifference. She picked up a small rock and threw it, missing slightly, then followed with a second that landed closer, striking near the bones with a dull crack. The bear lifted its head again, this time holding its gaze longer. I get a sense of dread reading this. The bear isn't ignoring her anymore, and I know how quickly things can escalate when a predator locks its attention. Philin began walking toward it. She closed the distance to roughly 70 yards, picking up a long, dried rib bone along the way. She struck it repeatedly against a rock, producing sharp, irregular sounds that carried across the open shoreline. The bear stopped feeding entirely and faced her directly. Its posture lowered, head aligned with its shoulders, attention fixed. Philin turned back toward her friends, raising her arms slightly as if to signal that nothing had happened. The bear charged. It covered the remaining distance in seconds, moving low and fast over the gravel. A warning shout came from behind her, but Philin hesitated, just long enough to lose any chance of retreat. She began to pivot, but the bear reached her before she could take more than a step. The first strike came from its right forepaw, connecting with her upper back and shoulder. The force knocked her off her feet and drove her forward into the ground. The impact fractured her scapula and tore open the skin across her back in deep, parallel lacerations. She managed a single scream before the bear closed over her. Its jaws locked onto the back of her neck. The bite force compressed the cervical spine, crushing vertebrae and severing the spinal cord. The effect was immediate. Her body went limp, movement ceasing within seconds. I think about how little time there is to react once a predator commits. There's almost no room for intervention. The bear maintained its grip briefly, then dragged her several feet toward the bone pile. Blood marked a continuous trail across the gravel. It released her neck and repositioned, biting into her thigh and tearing away muscle tissue in a single pull. It fed briefly, then shifted again, opening the abdominal cavity. Internal organs were exposed and displaced onto the ground as the bear fed in short intervals, pausing intermittently to look toward her friends. They ran to a nearby house and alerted a local whaling captain, who retrieved a rifle and drove to the shoreline. He fired warning shots from a distance, causing the polar bear to back off without fully leaving the area, and upon approaching on foot, he confirmed Philin had no signs of life. Wildlife officers later arrived and euthanized the bear when it refused to retreat. The coroner determined the cause of death to be catastrophic cervical spine trauma with severe soft tissue damage and blood loss, with alcohol intoxication noted as a contributing factor. The incident was ruled accidental, linked to proximity to a feeding site and behavior that provoked the animal. From my perspective, this could have been prevented at multiple points. Leaving when the bear was first spotted, avoiding provocation, or not drinking near a known hazard. Access to the bone pile in Kaktovik was temporarily restricted, with added patrols and barriers before normal seasonal activity resumed. In the region, encounters like this are understood as preventable when established safety boundaries are maintained. It was October 4th, 2016, on a citrus farm outside Tsenin, Limpopo, when a man was about to make a grave mistake with the sudden violence of fang and muscle. Peter Botha, 34, had worked the Lowveld his entire adult life. At Marula Ridge Farm, where he had been employed for 6 years, foremen trusted him with equipment and difficult labor. He was physically capable, rarely sick, and known for making decisions quickly and rarely reversing them. He had no formal training in wildlife handling, but had picked up small non-venomous snakes on farm property before, house snakes, juvenile pythons. His work that Tuesday was straightforward, clear overgrown citrus rows ahead of the weekend harvest alongside co-worker Dion Erasmus, 29. Both men had been at it since early morning, under a clear October sky. The eastern grove runs close to a Letaba River tributary, where fever trees and scrub shade the irrigation channels below. Limpopo Lowveld in early October sits at the edge of the wet season, warm, humid, and alive with insects and the animals that hunt them. The boomslang is a rear-fanged colubrid capable of reaching 5 feet in length, its body slender, and its eyes disproportionately large. Its venom is hemotoxic, methodically dismantling the blood's clotting system and triggering disseminated intravascular coagulation, a cascading failure in which clotting factors are consumed until hemorrhage becomes uncontrollable from within. Dion spotted the snake first, coiled in the crook of a fever tree branch, about 4 feet off the ground. Vivid green, with large motionless eyes. He told Peter to leave it and move to the next row. Farm management had circulated a written notice earlier that season about increased snake sightings near the irrigation channels following upstream flooding, advising workers to report encounters to the site supervisor rather than engage. Peter had been present at that briefing. He stepped toward the tree regardless, studying the snake from about 3 feet away. He reached up and attempted to grab the boomslang behind the head with his bare right hand, but his grip slipped almost immediately along the narrow neck. Dion, standing about 16 feet back, shouted at him to let it go. The snake bit once, a brief latch. Rather than a quick tap, its jaws working for a second before Peter pulled free, with contact to the palm of Peter's right hand. He released it, and the snake dropped into the brush and was gone. He held his hand up and looked at it. A small puncture, faint redness around the entry point, nothing more. He told Dion it felt like a bee sting. Neither man called the farm supervisor. Over the following 2 hours, he reported a mild headache and a heavy, fatigued feeling as bruising spread slowly across his palm and up into his wrist, pooling dark and soft beneath the skin. They improvised a tourniquet from a shirt sleeve cinched above the elbow and pressed a compress of crushed wild herbs, used locally for insect bites, against the wound. He held his arm elevated against a fence post, flexing his fingers periodically through the afternoon. The pain remained dull, and the swelling moved gradually enough that neither man treated it as an emergency. By 4 p.m., roughly 5 hours after, the bite. Peter's gums bled when he pressed his tongue to them. A shallow scratch on his forearm from the morning's brush clearing oozed steadily and would not close. He vomited once near the irrigation line and sat down on a root. The skin of his hand and forearm had turned mottled purple-black from the wrist upward, the tissue beneath swollen and tight. He was pale and moving with the deliberate slowness of someone trying not to fall. The whites of his eyes had turned visibly blood red from hemorrhage rather than clear. Dayon began calling the clinic in Sanin, about 12 miles away, at 5 p.m. He made 3 calls over 40 minutes. A nurse on the final call told him to bring Peter immediately and advised them to keep him still and remove any constriction, though the tourniquet remained in place. By then, his eyes were fully bloodshot with pooled hemorrhage. He was semi-conscious when they loaded him into the farm bakkie. He grew increasingly unresponsive during the drive, his breathing shallow and uneven. Emergency personnel met them on the road approximately 40 minutes after the final call. Peter had no pulse. Paramedics initiated resuscitation briefly, but found no response and no signs of reversible cause. He was pronounced dead. Peter was buried on family land east of Sanin 4 days after his death. To be honest, I can't muster any sympathy for a man who was explicitly warned at a farm briefing, told by his co-worker to leave it alone, and still reached barehanded for a boom slang, then shrugged off a bite as a bee sting, slapped on a tourniquet and some herbs, and waited until his eyes bled to call for help. It was the morning of July 29, 2017, along a narrow channel in the Okavango Delta in Botswana, where the water moved slowly between walls of papyrus, and the air smelled of mud and reeds. The channel was quiet, the surface was still. Nothing visible suggested any danger. That stillness is part of what makes the Delta so disarming. Priya Sharma, 29, was a travel vlogger from Mumbai, India, with a growing YouTube channel focused on solo female travel. She had approximately 22,000 subscribers and was building a series on destinations in sub-Saharan Africa. She was organized and detail-oriented in her planning, but she had no experience with crocodile habitats and had not researched the specific risks of Mokoro travel in the Delta. That gap between general preparation and specific knowledge is something I come back to often in these cases. Priya had planned the trip carefully, booked a reputable guide, and done the work. But she had not understood what the Delta specifically required of her, and that specific gap was the one that mattered. Her guide was a local operator named Cabo Sitol, 44, who had been running Mokoro tours in the Delta for over a decade. Cabo gave the same briefing every morning. Stay seated, keep hands and arms inside the canoe. At all times, do not lean toward the water. He explained that Nile crocodiles in the Delta were not always visible and could approach from directly below the surface. Priya had been filming throughout the trip, holding her camera over the side of the Mokoro to capture low-angle footage. Cabo had corrected her twice on the first day. She adjusted briefly each time, then returned to the same position. This is the part of the story that I find genuinely difficult to understand. The warning had been given clearly, more than once, and the reason behind it was explained, and yet the habit continued. I think there is something about calm water that makes people feel safe in a way that open savanna does not, and that false sense of calm is exactly what makes crocodile habitats so consistently deadly. A lion on the plains is visible. Nile crocodiles are ambush predators that wait submerged with only their eyes and nostrils above the waterline, detecting movement through vibration in the water before striking upward with explosive speed. An adult Nile crocodile can reach 16 feet in length and weigh over 1,500 pounds, with a bite force among the strongest of any living animal. What makes them particularly lethal is not the initial strike, it is what comes after. On the morning of July 29th, Priya was filming a slow pan across the water surface, leaning forward with her camera extended over the side of the Mokoro. Cabo told her to sit back. She held up a hand and continued filming. The crocodile had been stationary beneath the surface, less than 30 feet from the canoe. The strike came from below. The animal lunged upward and seized her right arm just below the elbow, pulling her forward and partially out of the Mokoro. Cabo grabbed her left arm with both hands and pulled hard. For a moment there was a struggle, Priya partially in the water, Cabo pulling from one side, the crocodile from the other. He was fighting with everything he had. The crocodile began to roll. The torque broke Cabo's grip. Priya went into the water. Cabo used the paddle to strike the surface repeatedly, but the crocodile had already submerged with her. The channel went still within seconds. The same stillness that had been there all morning returned as if nothing had happened. A response team arrived approximately 2 hours later. Priya's camera was recovered, floating near the reeds. Her body was found the following morning, partially submerged beneath a root system roughly a quarter-mile downstream. Post-mortem findings confirmed death by drowning, with significant trauma to the right arm and shoulder. The medical examiner noted that drowning was the primary cause. She had been held underwater, not killed by the initial strike. Cabo was cleared of negligence. He had given the warning, repeated it, and when the moment came, he had held on until the physics of the situation took that option away from him. Priya's family was notified through the Indian consulate. Her final video, uploaded 2 days before the incident, showed her boarding the Mokoro at sunrise, describing the delta as the most peaceful place she had ever been. She was not wrong about the beauty of it. She just did not know what was underneath it. It was September 3rd, 2016, in the Western Carpathian Mountains of Romania, a continuous stretch of beech forest running roughly 40 kilometers in every direction from the NGO research camp. High brown bear density, no fencing, no perimeter lighting, and the nearest ranger station, several hours away, by road. Stefan Varga was 39 and had left a private equity partnership in Budapest with enough money to pursue wildlife photography independently. He had applied 3 times to the NGO carnivore program before being accepted, and a substantial donation around the time of the 3rd application likely helped. He arrived with high-end equipment and a working method he was not prepared to adjust. Lena Brandt was 33, a graphic designer from Leipzig who had joined him for the final 10 days. She had no field background. On her second day, she asked a technician about bear spray. The technician recommended it. Varga rejected the suggestion and described deterrence as a false dependency that compromised the authenticity of his work. The spray stayed in the vehicle. She asked the right question on day 2. A trained technician backed her up. Varga overruled both of them. I keep thinking about what that conversation felt like for her. His permit had expired on September 1st. He had extended the stay to the 6th and arranged private transport via charter and ground transfer from a regional airfield approximately 2 hours away. The NGO had not sanctioned the extension. He had been tracking an adult male bear, 12 to 14 years old, with a notch in its left ear, naming it in his field notes and treating it as a subject rather than a hazard. He had been placing food at 3 deposit points, roughly 60 meters from camp, positioned to guide the animal through his primary camera angle. The sites were outside routine monitoring paths, in terrain dense enough that increased activity near camp was not immediately obvious. The NGO staff did not know. Lena did and objected. Varga described it as controlled methodology. It was a low-mast year, natural food was limited, and bears were ranging closer to human areas than usual. 2 days before the incident, the same bear had approached within 15 meters of camp and remained for 11 minutes. Varga recorded the encounter as non-threatening. Lena asked to leave. He told her one more day. On the morning of September 3rd, in low early light under the canopy, the bear approached silently and held position near the camp for several minutes, posture consistent with assessment of a known food source. It then moved directly toward the structure. Varga was outside. Lena was inside the tent. A bear conditioned to a feeding location does not approach it cautiously. It returns with expectation. The repeated deposits had established that association. The bear engaged the canvas with forelimb force, tearing through it and collapsing the frame. It entered the structure. Lena had no space to move or create distance. The attack was immediate and focused. It did not break off. Varga moved away from the structure. The bear did not pursue him immediately, but after remaining at the site, it followed the next available movement. Without a deterrent and in dense terrain, he was unable to make it far. The camp missed its scheduled check-in at 7:15. Concern was raised late morning, and rangers were contacted around 9:20, arriving in the early afternoon. The tent was partially destroyed from the outside. Lena Brandt's remains were found within the collapsed structure. Stefan Varga was located approximately 70 to 100 meters into the forest, partially covered with leaf litter and debris. The adult male bear with the notched left ear was identified at the site and euthanized during the recovery operation. It was August 22, 2014. The Gulf of Mexico sat flat and hazy under a late summer sky. The heat had been building since early morning, pressing down on the water's surface in a way that made the horizon shimmer and blur. By midday, the conditions offshore were typical for the season. Warm water, low visibility beneath the surface, a faint current moving through the area without enough force to clear the suspended particulate that reduced underwater sightlines to a matter of feet. From above, the water looked calm and empty. Leonard Brooks was 41 years old, an experienced spearfisher who had been working the area for several hours. Over the course of the session, he had secured multiple fish to his body as he worked, a standard and practical approach to spearfishing that allows a diver to retain their catch without returning to the surface repeatedly. It is a common practice. It is also one that transforms the diver into a continuous and concentrated source of biological material dispersing into the surrounding water. Blood and fluid from the catch spread steadily outward into the current from his position. He had been in the water long enough for that trail to extend a significant distance in multiple directions. Leonard wasn't being reckless. He was doing exactly what experienced spearfishers do, but the water had been registering his presence for hours before anything happened. Bull sharks are among the most dangerous and least predictable shark species in the world. They are highly responsive to olfactory stimuli, capable of detecting extremely low concentrations of dissolved biological compounds in the water, and are known to range widely through both offshore and nearshore environments, including river systems and shallow coastal waters. They are not selective in the way that some shark species are. They are opportunistic, persistent, and highly reactive to the combination of scent and movement that a struggling or bleeding animal produces in the water. Unlike many shark species that make a single investigatory contact and withdraw to assess the result, bull sharks engage in escalating feeding behavior once sufficiently stimulated. When multiple individuals are present in the same area and the stimulus is strong and sustained, that escalation can become rapid, a compounding response driven by increased chemical and movement cues in the water, drawing more animals in and accelerating the pace of the response. Once that chain reaction starts with bull sharks, it doesn't slow down. The first bite wasn't the beginning of the danger. It was the end of any window to avoid it. The first contact came as a bite to the torso and arm, investigatory, a shark assessing an unfamiliar object, but the wound changed the situation immediately. Blood entered the water directly from Leonard's body, compounding an already substantial scent trail. His movement in response generated exactly the erratic motion that amplifies a feeding response. A second animal arrived within minutes, then another. The escalation built rather than ignited, but once it was building, nothing interrupted it. That's the part I keep coming back to, not the sharks, the building. As Leonard became incapacitated, his orientation shifted, his body rising toward the surface, his head exposed as control collapsed. The facial injuries weren't deliberate, they were incidental, the result of repeated close-range contact once he had no position left to hold. With bull sharks, the window doesn't just close, it disappears. It was July 21st, 2018, in a Kenyan wildlife reserve near the Masai Mara. The late afternoon light was warm and orange across the dry grassland, and a large elephant herd was moving through a crossing on the dirt road ahead. The dust they raised drifted slowly in the still air. The safari vehicle had stopped to let them pass. Daniela Ferreira, 21, was a travel content creator from Indonesia who had built her following around dance videos filmed in unusual places: airports, rooftops, waterfalls. She described her content as cinematic and dreamlike, and her audience responded to it. She had been brought to Kenya by a small travel company that wanted scenic safari footage for a sponsored campaign. The company wanted harmless tourism content. Daniela wanted one clip that would be different from anything she had posted before. For months, she had been thinking about filming herself, dancing beside wild elephants in open savanna. She believed it would be peaceful and visually powerful, and exactly the kind of thing her audience would share. The guide briefed the group before they entered the reserve. Stay seated, no loud movements, maintain distance from the herd. Elephants with juveniles can become unpredictable very quickly. Daniela listened and then asked if she could step outside briefly. to film a dancing clip beside the herd. The guide refused immediately and repeated the warning. Daniela said she would stay close to the vehicle and it would only take a few seconds. She got out anyway with her phone in selfie mode. The guide said no, but she felt she knew better. I've heard that reasoning before, and it never ends the way the person saying it expects. She started filming close to the vehicle. Then she moved slightly to change the angle. Then again, to get more of the herd in frame. She was looking at her phone screen while she moved, and the distance between her and the vehicle grew without her registering it clearly. Her attention was on the composition, not on what the herd was doing. This is the moment that changed everything. The elephants had been crossing normally. Then, one older female stopped. Her ears spread outward. Several trunks lifted into the air. The younger elephants pulled together tightly in the center of the group. A loud cracking sound came from somewhere in the reserve nearby, the kind of abrupt noise that moves through a herd fast. The tension spread through the crossing formation within seconds. The guide saw it and began shouting for Daniela to return immediately. He started the engine and tried to get her attention. The tourists inside the vehicle had already understood that something had changed. Daniela heard the shouting and saw the shift in the herd, but misread it as a dramatic visual moment and backed slightly further into the roadway to keep the whole herd in frame. The matriarch pivoted. The herd broke from a controlled crossing into a panic-driven surge. Dust rose heavily across the road as multiple elephants pushed through at once. Daniela turned toward the vehicle and realized how far she had drifted from it. The ground was uneven and the dust had reduced visibility. The herd was moving across the road between her and the Jeep. One adult elephant came through the moving herd and struck her with a lateral movement of its head and tusk as it pushed forward with the momentum of the group behind it. The impact was not a targeted attack. The animal was moving with the herd, and she was in its path. The force of a full-grown elephant moving at speed is several tons of weight in motion. She was thrown sideways onto the road. Her phone landed in the dirt nearby and kept recording. The footage showed dust and violent shaking and shouting from the direction of the vehicles. Safari staff secured the remaining tourists and initiated emergency response immediately. Reserve authorities were contacted, and the crossing area was restricted. Responders reached Daniela on the road. The injuries from the impact were severe, including internal trauma and crush injuries to the chest and torso, consistent with being struck by a large animal at force. She was transported by emergency vehicle to the nearest medical facility. Despite medical intervention, Daniela Ferreira died from her injuries. She was 21 years old. The cause of death was recorded as traumatic internal injuries, consistent with impact from a large elephant during a herd movement event. Investigators later reviewed the recovered phone footage and the guide's account. They concluded Daniela had exited the vehicle voluntarily after being refused permission and warned of the risk, that she had drifted farther from the vehicle while focused on filming, and that the herd's panic response had been triggered by an environmental sound rather than any direct provocation. Her body was repatriated to Indonesia following the investigation. It was October 6th, 2013, in the foothills west of Sundre, Alberta. The elk rut was winding down. The bears were gorging before denning, and somewhere in the timber above the Clearwater drainage, a woman who had walked these hills for 20 years was about to discover that experience offers no guarantees. Martha Ellery was 42, a part-time hunting guide operating out of Sundre, who spent the other half of her year working dispatch for a wildlife management contractor. She carried bear spray on every trip, drilled her clients on what to do if things went sideways, and had a reputation among local outfitters for being methodical and unsentimental. This particular October trip was a 5-day ungulate hunt with 3 paying clients from Ontario, 2 brothers and a colleague. None of them unfamiliar with the bush, but none of them familiar with this country. The foothills west of Sundre compress into long, timbered ridges, broken by creek drainages, choked with willow and buffalo berry shrub, exactly the habitat a grizzly bear uses in the weeks before freeze-up. Grizzly bears in late hyperphagia are not the same animals encountered in early summer. A sow with cubs in October has spent months accumulating fat reserves and is operating under a level of defensive aggression that has no equivalent among North American wildlife. Martha had received an advisory the week before. Grizzly activity was elevated in the Sundre foothills, with 2 livestock kills within 12 kilometers of her route. She noted it, but didn't change plans. Her clients had come from Ontario, and the weather window was narrow, typical trade-offs that usually don't matter. On the morning of the 6th, the group moved through dense willows along a creek when one brother stopped to glass uphill. The wind shifted and swirled. Martha kept about 20 feet of spacing and used quiet voice checks in the thick cover, but the sow was already at close range, partially hidden and closing fast. Her cubs broke upslope. No bluff or warning. She was committed and covered the distance instantly. Martha had the spray off her hip in under 2 seconds. She deployed a full burst directly into the animal's path, and witnesses behind her saw the cloud expand forward, then drift left as the wind shifted again. The sow hit the spray cloud at an oblique angle, taking partial exposure across her muzzle and left eye, but she did not stop. She covered the remaining distance and struck Martha across the upper chest and left shoulder with her right forepaw, dropping her immediately onto her back. The impact was audible to the client standing behind her at a greater distance. Contact was forceful and immediate. The sow struck high with a forepaw, impacting Martha across the upper chest and left shoulder, driving her backward to the ground. As Martha fell, the bear followed through, pinning her with body weight and delivering a bite to the left arm, clamping above the elbow and shaking in a short, violent motion, consistent with a neutralizing response. Martha rolled partially onto her front under the force, and the sow shifted her grip, placing her jaws at the back of the neck and base of the skull. Witnesses described a single, sustained bite with downward pressure before release. The bear disengaged abruptly after that contact, lifting off and moving laterally back into the willows rather than pursuing further. The cubs were no longer visible, and the sow's retreat path aligned with where they had fled moments earlier. One client reached the radio and raised emergency dispatch, while the other two pulled Martha onto higher ground. Response teams arrived by off-road vehicle in 33 minutes. Martha was unconscious and had lost significant blood volume. She died before the evacuation reached the paved road. The coroner's report noted blunt force trauma to the thorax, bilateral rib fractures, severe lacerations and crush injury to the left arm, and a fatal compression fracture to the cervical spine at C2, consistent with a large predator's bite grip. Martha Ellery knew about grizzly country. She respected it. The wind shifted and moved through the drainage in ways that could not be fully predicted, and it scares me to think none of that preparation was enough. It was August 3rd, 2016, during one of the driest summers Northern California had seen in years. And when conditions get like that, wildlife starts showing up in places you don't usually expect. Closer to farms, homes, anywhere they can find food or water. Arjun Mehta, 52, was a software engineer from San Jose, visiting his cousin's mountain farm for the first time in years. He'd spent most of his life in urban environments, far removed from anything like this. Growing up in India, he'd heard stories from his grandfather about driving off leopards and tigers, stories about courage, about protecting your home, and I think those stories stuck with him more than he realized. Because sometimes, when you've heard something enough, it starts to feel like something you could do too. The night before everything happened, a mountain lion had killed several chickens from his cousin's coop. The signs were clear: tracks, scattered feathers, the kind of damage that pointed to a large predator. His cousin already had a plan: move the remaining chickens, contact wildlife officials, handle it the right way. But Arjun didn't like the idea of just waiting, and I get it. Nobody wants to feel like they're just letting something dangerous hang around. But at the same time, there's a difference between wanting to help and actually knowing how to handle the situation. Arjun started thinking of the mountain lion as just a bigger version of the animals from the stories he grew up hearing. Something that could be scared off with enough confidence, which isn't really how it works. He spent the day coming up with what he thought was a solid plan. Nothing complicated, just positioning himself near the house with rocks, ready to scare the animal away if it came back. And I don't know, this is one of those moments where it feels like things are being oversimplified, like treating a wild predator as if it's going to react the way you expect it to. That evening, just before sunset, he saw it. The mountain lion had returned, moving quietly near the chicken coop. This could have been the moment to stay inside, call for help, let someone trained deal with it. Instead, Arjun rushed outside. He grabbed a handful of stones, shouting as he moved toward the animal, throwing them in its direction. In his mind, it probably felt like he was taking control of the situation, doing exactly what those old stories described. But this wasn't the same situation. The mountain lion wasn't out in the open, with room to escape. It was near the barn, with limited space behind it, and without realizing it, Arjun kept moving forward. That's the part that really changes everything, because now, instead of scaring the animal away, he was cutting off its escape route. The mountain lion didn't run, it turned. And when a predator like that feels cornered, it doesn't hesitate. The attack was immediate. The lion launched forward, covering the distance in seconds and knocking Arjun to the ground. During the struggle, it used its hind claws, powerful, sharp, built for gripping and tearing, and struck his upper thigh. The injury was severe. Arjun tried to fight back, but there was no real way to defend against that kind of speed and force. The entire encounter lasted only a few minutes. Then, the mountain lion disengaged and fled. By the time Arjun's cousin came looking for him about 30 minutes later, he was already on the ground behind the barn. The wounds had caused catastrophic damage, including a severed femoral artery, leading to rapid blood loss. Emergency services were called, but there was nothing that could be done. The medical examiner ruled the case an accidental death caused by a mountain lion attack, citing fatal blood loss from the injuries sustained during the encounter. Wildlife officials later tracked the animal and relocated it to a more remote area, determining that its behavior had been defensive. Reports noted that the mountain lion had been reacting to a perceived threat after being cornered. Following the incident, the farm implemented additional safety measures, including motion-activated lighting and reinforced enclosures for livestock. Local authorities also used the case to educate residents on proper wildlife response protocols. No further mountain lion incidents were reported in the area after those changes were put in place. It was February 17th, 2016. Neptune Islands, South Australia. A shark cage diving vessel running a scheduled excursion at one of the most well-known great white shark sites in the world. The water was cold and clear. A large great white shark, estimated at around 15 feet, had been circling the cage for the better part of the session, passing within inches of the bars on repeated loops. Elliot Grant was 27. He worked in construction and had booked the trip as part of a group holiday with friends. He had no prior experience with large, predatory sharks. He was not there because of a long-held interest in marine life. He was there because it was on his list of things to do that most people would not. His friends were watching from the deck above. But what started as joking among them gradually turned into a cash dare. By the time the bet was made, it had reached $500. The objective was simple. Open the latch, step outside briefly, come back in. I wonder what they were thinking. A 15-foot great white actively circling, and the dare was to open the door. Before entry, the crew ran a full safety briefing. The rules were explained clearly and physically demonstrated. One rule carried more weight than the others. They were told not to open the cage latch underwater. Keep all body parts inside the cage at all times. The latch was accessible from inside, as was standard for that cage design at the time. Elliot heard the briefing, acknowledged it, and entered the cage. Approximately 20 minutes. Into the dive, the shark was still circling. It had been making close passes for most of the session. Nothing had gone wrong. Elliot reached for the latch and opened it himself, the cage door outward. He leaned his upper body outside into open water. His arm was now fully exposed beyond the cage barrier. The shark was a 15-foot great white that had been circling in actively baited water for the better part of 20 minutes. It was not a passive animal waiting to be observed. The moment Elliot's arm was exposed in open water, the animal responded without delay. The bite was single, immediate, and severe. The jaw closed on the exposed arm with a force that severed major vessels instantly. Blood loss began at a rate that nothing on board could address. The crew above saw the breach as it happened, but could not reach him before contact occurred. They pulled him back through the cage opening and onto the vessel as quickly as the injury allowed. He was on deck within minutes. The vessel was miles from shore. What was available on board was not built for vascular trauma at that level. Emergency services were contacted the moment he was out of the water. The bleeding could not be controlled during the transit. Elliot Grant died on board before the vessel reached land. He was 27 years old. His body was returned home. Post-incident review confirmed that the cage latch had been opened deliberately by Elliot, that the safety briefing had been conducted in full, that the rule had been clearly communicated and physically demonstrated, and that the cage barrier had been functioning correctly before his interference. The operating company replaced the interior accessible latch mechanism with a crew-operated external lock that participants could not reach from inside the cage. No regulatory action was taken against the operator. It was August 3rd, 2014, and the dry heat of the Limpopo bush pressed over the Olifants River corridor with a weight that makes the ground feel closer than it should. The kind of afternoon that ends badly for people who confuse stillness with safety. Thomas van Rensburg was 28, a mechanic from Sanine, who spent his weekends filming reptiles in the scrubland bordering Kruger National Park, where he lived in a rural cabin and had spent enough time outdoors to believe he understood what lived there. Based on what I've read, he was not a trained handler or a herpetologist. He owned 2 hard drives of wildlife footage, monitor lizards, puff adders, whatever moved, shared between friends, and never sold. His reputation among the group he hiked with was of someone who pushed past the point others stopped at. He had survived enough close calls that risk had become habit rather than warning. He had spent weeks planning this particular stretch for its rocky riverbed outcroppings, where snakes concentrated during the dry season. His 3 companions, Luan, Kobus, and Danny, had made trips with him before and understood his pattern. The campsite sat in dry Mopane scrub above a sand-bottomed bend of the Oliphants, the terrain all flat rock and dead grass. The black mamba is among the fastest land snakes on the continent, capable of roughly 10 to 12 miles per hour in short bursts. Its venom is almost entirely neurotoxic. Without antivenom, a single bite can kill an adult human within hours, and when provoked, the mamba does not strike once. They found the snake near a granite shelf at late afternoon. It had already raised the front third of its body off the ground, mouth slightly parted, the black interior clearly visible. As Thomas stepped closer, the snake shifted laterally along the rock, angling away as if to escape before stopping and turning back toward him. Luan told Thomas they should back away. Kobus agreed. Thomas picked up a branch from the ground and said he only wanted footage of it moving. His camera was already recording from where he had set it down moments earlier, angled toward the rock. The snake held its position. He prodded it once. It contracted sharply and turned. He prodded it again. The first strike came before anyone registered movement. A dry, flat impact against skin, followed by Thomas jerking his left forearm to his chest. The snake surged forward in a rapid sequence of strikes, 2 landing cleanly on the same forearm within seconds, while others glanced off as he recoiled. Thomas sat back and came down hard on the granite. His friends moved toward him immediately. 2 puncture sites were visible on the inner forearm, already welling and darkening at the margins. They pulled out their phones. No signal among the 4 of them. The nearest ranger station was a multi-hour hike in daylight. The light was already going. During their hike, the neurotoxin moved through him in sequence. Peripheral sensory disruption first, then progressive motor failure, then the respiratory muscles. His breathing became audible, a shallow mechanical pull against a chest that was no longer responding correctly. His fingers moved involuntarily along the sleeping pad beneath him. When Kobus spoke directly to him, Thomas opened his mouth and produced only a whisper, the muscles of his face already losing precision. Luan wrapped a cloth tightly above the bite, and they tried to keep his arm still against his body, speaking to him to keep him responsive as long as possible. They assembled a stretcher from 2 hiking poles lashed to sleeping pads with paracord, moving as quickly as 4 people in shock could manage. They were carrying him within 12 minutes of the second bite. The terrain was uneven and broken, the trail barely visible once the last light left. They rotated at the poles every few hundred meters. They lost the trail twice and had to backtrack. Thomas was fully unresponsive by the second hour, his breathing reduced to something barely audible. Somewhere during the third hour, carrying him down a dry riverbed in the dark, his chest stopped moving. They did not stop walking. They reached a gravel road after roughly 4 hours and flagged down a passing farm vehicle. A ranger arrived at approximately 11:40 p.m. Thomas was already dead. No antivenom had been administered at any point. The field coroner's report noted 2 puncture wounds on the left forearm consistent with large elapid envenomation, no evidence of treatment administered, and cause of death as acute respiratory failure due to neurotoxic envenomation. Honestly, I don't feel sorry for him. I feel sorry for Luan, Kobus, and Danny, who had to watch a grown man's ego write a check his respiratory system couldn't cash. Thomas van Rensburg didn't die because the mamba was fast. He died because he was too stupid to stop poking it. It was the late afternoon of August 6, 2013, in a private game reserve in the Limpopo province of South Africa, where the bush was dry and the grass had turned yellow from months without rain. Near the reserve's northern boundary, a small group of spotted hyenas had been feeding on a carcass since midday. Animals move differently when water is scarce. Johan van Rensburg, 44, was a South African safari guide with over 15 years of experience in the Limpopo bushveld. Widely respected among colleagues, he had guided hundreds of clients through the same terrain without incident. That familiarity had also produced a quiet confidence in his own judgment, a belief that he could read a situation accurately enough to act where others would not. I think this is one of the most dangerous places a person in the field can end up. Not ignorance, but the kind of experience that starts to feel like immunity. Understanding how animals behave from a vehicle, or with clients, or in the dozens of situations that resolved without incident is not the same as being on foot, alone, at a feeding site, with no deterrent and no backup. Johan received a report that hyenas had been active near the northern fence line with signs of a fresh kill. He decided to investigate on foot, alone, before nightfall. He told a colleague he would be back within the hour. That detail, telling someone he would be back within the hour, suggests he understood there was some level of risk involved. He simply believed that his experience was sufficient to manage it. That belief was the error. Spotted hyenas are highly social and intelligent animals, and their behavior around an active kill is something I think most people, even experienced guides, underestimate. A clan at a feeding site is in a state of heightened arousal, competitive and territorial, with a bite force exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush the femur of a large ungulate cleanly. What makes them particularly dangerous in a group is not just their physical capability, but their coordination. They test, they flank, and they escalate in stages. If the test is not answered correctly, the next stage follows almost automatically. Johan located the feeding site, roughly half a mile from the fence line, and counted at least 6 animals. The constant whooping and giggling vocalizations went quiet the moment he arrived. That silence was a signal Johan recognized. He had heard it before from vehicles. He had never heard it while standing on foot, and from what I've studied, that distinction matters enormously. The animals were not ignoring him. They were assessing him. The nearest animal turned to face him fully, head low, shoulders raised. 2 others shifted to his sides without approaching. Johan took a slow step backward. The nearest animal took a step forward. He recognized the escalation and began backing away more deliberately. But what he misread was the animal that had circled wide through the brush and was now less than 15 feet behind him. That is the part of this story that I find most significant. Johan was reading the situation in front of him, tracking the animal facing him, monitoring the 2 that had flanked him. He was doing what an experienced guide would do, but the hyena behind him had moved through the brush without making a sound, and by the time Johan knew it was there, the distance was already gone. The bite came from behind, catching him across the back of his right thigh. He spun and struck the animal hard across the snout. It released and backed off, vocalizing loudly. The rest of the clan responded to the sound. The intimidation phase was over. Johan fought back. He was large and physically strong, but on the ground, outnumbered, without any deterrent, the situation deteriorated quickly. He sustained bites to both legs, his abdomen, and his right hand before a reserve patrol vehicle approached on a nearby track, and the animals scattered. The sound of the vehicle was enough. The hyenas moved into the brush and were gone. That speed of dispersal is something I think about in the context of what Johan had been trying to do. He had gone out there believing he could manage the situation on foot. A vehicle, just the sound of one, accomplished in seconds what he could not accomplish at all. The patrol team reached him within minutes. He was alive and conscious, telling them what had happened. The wounds to his abdomen were the most serious. He died en route to the reserve's medical post from blood loss, with the abdominal injuries identified as the primary factor. He had been conscious long enough to describe the encounter, which means he knew in those final minutes exactly what had happened and why. The reserve issued updated protocols prohibiting solo foot approaches to active predator feeding sites under any circumstances, regardless of experience level. Johan recognized the silence. It was August 8th, 2015. The Pacific Ocean, approximately 40 nautical miles off Guadalupe Island, Mexico. The water was clear and the seas were flat. Conditions were calm in every direction. There was nothing between the vessel and the horizon. Richard Hargrove was 54 and worked as a property developer in Newport Beach, California, and the people who knew him well said he was the kind of man who decided he wanted something and did not stop until he had it, no matter what it cost or what anyone said. He had been on boats his whole life, chartered trips, crude passages, weekends on other people's yachts, and at some point he had decided he needed one of his own. He saved for 3 years alongside his business income and bought a $2 million sailing yacht and named it after his wife. He hired a captain with 22 years of blue water experience and 11 Baja coastal passages behind him. 6 weeks before the voyage, the captain recommended a coastal route staying within 30 nautical miles of shore and formally advised against transiting the Guadalupe aggregation zone during peak season. Richard listened to all of it and still would not change the route because the sharks were part of why he wanted to go there. The captain resigned. Richard hired a replacement with less experience and no prior operational experience in the Guadalupe aggregation zone, and he never told him what the first captain had explained. A man with 22 years walked off that boat because of this route. I genuinely cannot understand hiring his replacement and keeping that conversation to yourself. Richard's wife Carol was 51, and his son Blake was 28, and the three of them set off on what was planned as a 10-day cruise. The first few days were easy and relaxed, with good food and music on deck, and long afternoons watching the water. And Richard had been enjoying himself so much that the warning the first captain had given him had started to feel like something that belonged to a different conversation. No sharks had been sighted since they entered the aggregation zone, and the ocean looked calm and empty and safe. On the afternoon of day 4, at around 2:15, Blake decided to go in the water. The cruise was about halfway through, and he wanted to feel the open ocean before it was over, and since nothing had been spotted, he climbed down and swam away from the hull. No formal in-water safety protocol or lookout was in place. Carol stayed on deck and Richard was below, and Blake said he would be quick. At 2:23, a shark struck Blake from below in a vertical approach with no warning. Carol had been watching from the rail and waiting for him to surface when the water around him erupted. She could see him from where she stood, screaming and fighting to get back to the surface, and she screamed and called for Richard. Richard came up from below and saw Blake in the water and went over the side himself without stopping, entering the water within seconds. I have to be honest, I do not know what I would do in that moment. I would like to think I would know better. I do not think I would. Blake was still at the surface when Richard reached him, but the water around them was already heavily discolored, and Blake was still moving erratically, which kept the shark in the area. The shark had not broken off. It had already begun feeding, and it came back before Richard could get his son to the hull, returning from below the same way it had the first time. Blake went under. The blood concentration in the water by that point was significant, and Richard was directly inside it when the shark came through again. It struck him from the side with enough force to roll him under the surface. He came up once and then did not come up again. The captain sent a mayday at 2:26, and it was acknowledged within a minute, with rescue estimated at approximately 2.5 hours out. He attempted to maneuver the vessel closer to where the two men had gone under, and during that maneuver, the prop shaft seal, which the pre-voyage survey had flagged as showing early corrosion fatigue, failed under the load. Water began entering the vessel through the shaft housing. The automatic bilge pump activated, but the ingress rate exceeded its capacity within several minutes, and a secondary compartment the captain could not access or isolate began flooding. The yacht began listing to port. Carol was at the rail, trying to see what was happening in the water below. Standing on a wet deck with an increasing port list, reducing stable footing, the yacht shifted, and she had nothing firm to hold, and she went into the water. The sharks that had been drawn toward the blood and surface disturbance were still in the area. They also attacked her. She did not come back up. By 2:44, the captain transmitted an update reporting the stern was going under. He moved to the bow and held position. Rescuers reached the vessel at 4:51 and recovered him. He was the only person on board. Blake Hargrove was 28, Richard Hargrove was 54, and Carol Hargrove was 51. None of them were recovered from the water. The investigation reviewed the route selected, the resignation of the original captain, the decision to transit the Guadalupe aggregation zone during peak season without disclosing known risk factors to the replacement captain, and the deferred maintenance on the prop shaft seal identified in the pre-voyage survey. The original captain provided a statement and did not elaborate beyond the facts. The yacht was eventually salvaged, repaired, and offered at auction. It did not sell. It was renamed and added to a rental fleet. He wanted to see the sharks. He chose to be where they were. It was August 4th, 2015. The Arctic summer had kept the sky pale and bright, well past what would conventionally be considered nighttime, the sun sitting low on the horizon in a long, slow arc. The light was flat and shadowless, flattening distance and making it difficult to judge how far away something was or how fast it was moving. A cold wind came off the ice shelf to the north and pushed across the open tundra in steady, unbroken gusts. The terrain was exposed and largely featureless. Low scrub, rocky ground, patches of persistent snow. Visibility was long in every direction. There was nowhere to hide and nothing to hide behind. Thomas Eriksson was 38 years old, a field researcher at a remote scientific camp on a Norwegian Arctic island. He had worked in the region for 3 seasons. The camp's safety protocols were clear. Never move between structures alone. Always carry a firearm. On the evening of August 4th, he made a short solo trip between 2 structures less than 200 meters apart, carrying only a flare gun. It was a trip he had made many times. It felt low risk. That assessment was wrong. If I was Thomas, I'm carrying the actual firearm every single time. I don't care if it's 20 meters. You're in polar bear country. The rules exist for a reason. Polar bears are the largest land predator on Earth. Adult males regularly exceeding 1,000 pounds. They are obligate carnivores whose entire biology is oriented around the pursuit and killing of large prey. They do not attack humans defensively. When a polar bear engages a human, it is almost always predation. They are patient, intelligent hunters, documented stalking prey over long distances using terrain and wind direction. Their jaws are adapted for crushing through the hide, blubber, and bone of large marine mammals. They kill by targeting the head and neck. A large male had been approaching from the north, downwind, using the slight undulations in the ground to minimize its profile. By the time Thomas registered movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, the bear had already broken into a full run. He discharged the flare gun. The flare struck the ground beyond the animal. The bear did not break stride. The initial contact knocked Thomas off his feet and drove him face first into the rocky ground. The bear's forepaws pinned his upper back. Its jaws closed on the back and right side of his head. A single crushing bite that fractured the occipital bone and drove into the temporal region simultaneously. The force was not precise. It was overwhelming. The orbital socket collapsed. The cheekbone, jaw, and surrounding facial structure fractured in the same movement. The bear then bit into the left side of the neck and began dragging him across the ground. Colleagues inside the nearest structure had heard the flare. They saw the bear dragging Thomas, retrieved the camp firearm, and exited. 2 shots were fired at close range. The bear released Thomas, retreated, and was shot a second time. The attack lasted well under 2 minutes. Under 2 minutes. The entire thing. And the colleagues had the actual gun the whole time. It was just sitting inside. That detail is hard to shake. Thomas was found face down and unresponsive. The occipital bone was fractured at the bite point. The right orbital socket had collapsed, the eye displaced from the compressive force. The cheek and temporal region bore wounds consistent with crushing and shearing, with fracturing of the underlying bone and penetration into the oral cavity. Significant soft tissue was missing from the upper face. The left side of the neck showed deep puncture wounds from the drag bite. Blood loss was substantial. Weather and the camp's remote location delayed air evacuation until the following morning. Camp staff managed his airway and controlled bleeding through the night. He reached a mainland trauma facility the next day. He survived, though reconstruction required multiple surgeries and left permanent disfigurement across the right side of his face. The bear was examined afterward. Human tissue was recovered and confirmed as Thomas's. Investigators determined the animal had approached from downwind, used available terrain to minimize its profile, and targeted a lone individual, a sequence consistent with deliberate predatory stalking. The incident was ruled an occupational accident. The protocol failure was noted: moving alone without a firearm, a brief deviation. The consequences were neither brief nor proportional to the lapse that caused them, and that's the part that lingers. It wasn't stupidity. It wasn't arrogance. It was just a short walk he'd done 100 times before. The Arctic doesn't care about your track record. It was March 18th, 2018, in the Northern Territory of Australia. The afternoon was fading, and the riverbank was quiet in the way that remote places are quiet. Not peaceful exactly, just empty of anything human. The mangroves pressed in close on both sides, and the water between them was dark and gave nothing back. Nguyen Minh, 26, had come from Vietnam with a tripod, 2 camera bags, and a plan that made sense to him in the way plans make sense to people who have never had one go badly wrong. His channel had started by accident. A video of him nearly slipping off a waterfall in Dalat had gone viral without warning. Comments calling him fearless. Sponsorship money that helped his parents. The earlier video had taught him the wrong lesson. Surviving danger had started to feel like understanding it. That is the sentence I stopped at. Surviving something and understanding it are not the same thing. That gap is what brought him to that riverbank. But as time went by, the numbers were down. Newer creators were filming things that made his content look cautious by comparison, and his audience had noticed. He had been watching Australian crocodile jump videos for weeks. Clips of saltwater crocodiles launching vertically from the water towards suspended bait. He told his followers he was going to film the closest crocodile jump ever recorded. He believed the gap between what looked dangerous and what actually was dangerous was something he could manage. He arrived at the river system and walked past the designated tourist platforms without stopping. I need to point this out. The safe version of exactly what he wanted was right there. Steel mesh. Proper positioning. He walked past it and kept going for nearly a mile. They were reinforced with steel mesh and positioned well back from the water. He kept going, nearly a mile into a restricted area marked with warning signs, until he found a section of bank that felt right. The ground was mangrove root and mud that stayed wet regardless of the sun. He tested the footing twice before setting up and convinced himself it was stable enough. He positioned his tripod near the waterline and began his live stream. The stream quality dropped repeatedly as the connection weakened near the river system. Viewers later reported the feed freezing several times before anything happened. The water was flat and nothing happened. Chat messages came in, accusing him of staging it. His feet were on a moss-covered root above the mud, and his eyes were on his phone screen. A wildlife ranger named Daniel was on patrol nearby when he spotted movement along the restricted bank. At first, he assumed someone was illegally baiting crocodiles for footage. He saw the tripod and the rope with bait hanging above the water, and as he got closer, he understood the full situation. He left his vehicle and ran toward the bank, shouting for Minh to move back. By the time the crocodile surfaced, there was almost no time left to react. Minh tried to pull back. His foot slipped. He reached for a tree trunk nearby and briefly caught it, but his weight had already moved past the point where catching anything would help. He went forward and down toward the water. The crocodile took him by the torso at the waterline. The bite closed with enough force to fracture several ribs and compress the chest cavity on contact. The animal immediately initiated a death roll, rotating its body violently in the water to destabilize and submerge its target. The rolling motion caused catastrophic internal injuries and drove him below the surface. A saltwater crocodile of that size generates enough rotational force to tear through muscle and bone. He would not have remained conscious for long after the initial bite. Mercer reached the bank within seconds and initially believed Minh had surfaced farther down the bank. He searched the shoreline for several seconds before realizing he was gone. The cause of death was later recorded as traumatic internal injuries and drowning consistent with crocodile attack. The combination of the initial bite, the death roll, and submersion meant survival was not possible after the first seconds of contact. The live stream had kept recording through the freezes and the signal drops. Recordings spread across platforms within hours, and Nguyen Minh was pronounced dead at the scene. His body was recovered the following morning. His camera equipment was still on the bank where he had positioned it. One of the camera batteries was still charging through a portable power bank when investigators recovered the equipment. Investigators concluded he had deliberately entered a restricted area, ignored multiple warning signs, and misjudged how quickly the crocodile could close the gap. The safety margin he believed he had did not exist. It was September 3rd, 2015. Neptune Islands, South Australia. A shark cage diving vessel running a scheduled excursion at one of the most established great white shark dive sites in the world. A research team was on board that day, observing and documenting the behavior of a large female great white estimated at approximately 17 feet. The animal had been present since the session began. Vincent Cole was 39. He ran an adventure travel blog and had built a following around experiences that most people would not attempt. Shark cage diving was not new to him. He had completed 47 prior cage dives across multiple locations and considered himself well beyond the level of a standard participant. He was familiar with procedures, familiar with how sharks moved around cages, and had developed what he believed was a reliable ability to read their behavior from inside. That confidence was not unfounded in a general sense. It was misapplied on September 3rd. Before entry, the crew ran the standard safety briefing. The rules were clear. Stay inside the cage. Follow crew instructions immediately and without question. If a recall is issued, exit without delay. Vincent had heard versions of this briefing 47 times before he entered the cage. The female great white had been circling the cage since early in the session. The research team on board was documenting her behavior, and what they observed was not typical. Her circling pattern was tighter than normal. She was making repeated close passes with a consistency that suggested heightened interest rather than routine investigation. Visible jaw movement was noted during several of the passes. The researchers flagged the behavior to the crew. The crew issued a recall. All divers were instructed to exit the cage immediately. The other participants began moving toward the exit. Vincent stayed where he was. The crew repeated the instruction. He told them they were overreacting. He said he had more experience than anyone else in the water and that he could read the shark. He said the animal was not a threat. While the other divers cleared the cage, he remained at his position and leaned forward toward the bars rather than moving back toward the exit. He removed one hand from the internal grip bar. His body shifted toward the door seam where the cage opening was widest. This part still bothers me. The crew said it twice. Vincent Cole, 47 dives deep, told all of them to relax. The female great white came through on another close pass while he was in that position. Vincent lost his footing on the cage floor. As he stumbled forward, his arm slipped through the gap at the door seam, crossing the cage boundary into open water at the moment the shark completed her pass at close range. The animal reacted without hesitation. The bite closed on the exposed forearm. She followed it immediately with a forceful lateral shake. The motion wrenched the arm hard against the doorframe before the crew could reach him. The radial and ulnar arteries were torn. The injury was catastrophic from the first moment of contact. Blood loss was immediate and severe. Crew members on the vessel pulled him from above the waterline, hauling the cage line and reaching down from the deck. Vincent was on the deck within minutes, but the damage could not be reversed with what was available on board. Emergency response was initiated, and the vessel turned for shore. Vincent Cole died on board before reaching land. He was 39 years old. Post-incident review confirmed that he had refused a direct recall instruction, repeated across approximately 90 seconds, that his positioning at the cage door seam was inconsistent with proper protocol, and that the other participants had exited without incident. The operating company introduced physical confirmation steps requiring crew sign-off before any participant could remain in the cage during a recall. 47 dives. A recall he ignored twice. Every other participant was already clear. He was the only one still in the water. It was March 14th, 2018, on a 340-acre private compound outside Missoula. Cold and still in the early morning, the kind of quiet that comes from being far enough from everything that no outside sound reaches the property. Dale Crawford was 54 and had built a technology infrastructure company in Seattle into something large enough that a European consortium had spent 3 years trying to buy it, with a final investor meeting scheduled for that morning. He had moved to the Montana compound a few years earlier after regulatory scrutiny around his business. The property included multiple outbuildings, one of which had been constructed without permits and was not accurately listed in property records. That outbuilding housed a 5-year-old male lion named Aries. On paper, the animal was owned by a licensed exotic exhibitor, leasing space on the property under the Animal Welfare Act. In practice, Crawford had sourced the animal through brokers and made decisions about its care. The arrangement had not been recently inspected and did not meet proper separation standards. The caretaker, Roy Morrow, had reported for weeks that the enclosure latch was degrading and misaligned, weakened further by repeated pressure from the animal. 11 days before the meeting, a replacement part was ordered. In the meantime, a secondary chain and a consumer padlock were added. No additional restrictions were put in place around the enclosure. I want to be fair. I understand that people convince themselves things are handled. This was not handled. The meeting began at 10 a.m., with participants both on-site and remote. Catering activity in the main house carried noise and food scent outward. The lion returned to the weakened latch point, applied force, and the primary latch failed. The chain held briefly before the padlock housing fractured. The gate opened. The enclosure sat about 80 meters from the main house. The lion reached the structure in under a minute and entered through a service corridor door left open for catering. Inside, it moved toward the source of sound and activity, pausing briefly at the meeting room entrance before entering. It focused on movement, reached Dale Crawford, and took him to the ground before anyone could respond. The attack was rapid and forceful. One attendee attempting to exit was seriously injured, while another escaped through a side door. Remote participants witnessed the entry before the feed cut. Roy Morrow, already nearby due to repeated checks, saw the animal move toward the house and retrieved a dart rifle. He reached the scene within minutes. Emergency services had been called, but rural response time exceeded 30 minutes. A first dart slowed the animal, and a second was required. Full immobilization took additional time. Crawford was pronounced dead at the scene. The injured attendee was airlifted to hospital. The investigation cited violations of the Animal Welfare Act and related statutes. The unlicensed structure and prior maintenance reports were noted. A civil case followed. The acquisition collapsed under a morality clause, and the animal was later transferred to an accredited sanctuary. It was September 19th, 2015, deep in the wilderness of Montana, and this was one of those seasons where grizzly bear activity was higher than usual. The kind of time when experienced hunters start being extra cautious, not less, because out there, you're not at the top of the food chain. Gideon Rusk, 45, was a bow hunter from Colorado with over 20 years of experience, and not just casual experience, he was serious about it. The kind of guy who invested heavily in his gear, custom bows, premium, optics, specialized equipment, everything top tier. I've seen people like this before, where the gear isn't just equipment, it's almost personal. Like losing it would feel worse than it probably should. Gideon had spent close to $8,000 on this hunting trip, and part of that included a set of limited edition arrows he'd been talking about for months. So when things didn't go as planned, he took it harder than most would. During the hunt, he spotted a large bull elk and took his shot, but it wasn't clean. The arrow struck poorly, and the elk bolted into thick brush, disappearing into dense cover with one of those expensive arrows still lodged in its body. And I get it, missing a shot like that probably feels frustrating, maybe even embarrassing, but this is where things start to shift. His hunting partner immediately noticed warning signs: fresh grizzly scat, claw marks on nearby trees, disturbed ground, all clear indicators that a bear had been in the area recently. And from what I've heard, that's usually your cue to back off, especially when visibility is low and you're dealing with wounded prey. But Gideon couldn't let it go. His partner warned him not to go in. Gideon went anyway. He convinced himself he could move quickly, grab the arrow, and get out. In his mind, it probably felt controlled, manageable. But the moment he stepped into that brush, everything changed. The visibility dropped almost instantly. Thick vegetation, limited sightlines. You're basically moving blind at that point. And instead of scanning ahead, Gideon was focused on the ground, following the blood trail. What he didn't realize was that something else had already found the elk, a grizzly bear, and not just passing through. It had claimed the elk as a food source, which makes this situation even worse, because now it's not just about crossing paths with a predator. It's about walking into something it's actively protecting. When Gideon pushed through the brush and entered the clearing, he walked straight into it. No warning, no time to react. The bear charged immediately, and this is the part people underestimate: how fast they move. There's no buildup, no chance to think things through. 1 second it's there, the next, it's on you. Gideon barely had time to register what was happening before the grizzly closed the distance. The impact knocked him to the ground, and within seconds, the bear delivered a crushing bite to his head and neck. The force alone was catastrophic. His hunting partner, about 250 yards away, heard the noise, shouting, crashing brush, then silence. He started yelling, banging equipment together, trying to scare the bear off, but it was already over. The entire encounter lasted less than a minute. By the time his partner reached the scene, Gideon was lying near the elk carcass, unresponsive. The injuries were severe. His cervical spine and trachea had been crushed, causing immediate death. The arrow he had gone in to retrieve was still lodged in the elk, exactly where the bear had been feeding. Wildlife officials later investigated and determined the bear had acted defensively while protecting its food source, which is standard behavior in that situation. Due to the fatal nature of the attack, the bear was located and euthanized in accordance with wildlife management protocols. the case was ruled an accidental death resulting from a wildlife encounter. Investigators noted that entering an active feeding site significantly increased the risk of a defensive attack. The outfitter involved in the trip later reinforced safety guidelines, emphasizing that no equipment should be retrieved under those conditions. It was the evening of October 3rd, 2016, in a private conservancy bordering the Masai Mara in Kenya, where the sky had turned deep orange and the savanna grass caught the last light of the day. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, the bush shifted. Animals that had rested through the afternoon heat began to move. The conservancy was the kind of place that looked, from a distance, like a postcard. Golden light, open plains, the silhouette of acacia trees against a fading sky. Madison Blake, 22, was an American Instagram model from Scottsdale, Arizona. Her account had grown steadily on the back of luxury travel content, carefully staged photographs in remote locations that made the wild look effortless and safe. She had roughly 31,000 followers and was building toward brand partnerships. Her content relied on proximity, not just beautiful landscapes, but herself inside them, close enough to make the image feel real. She had no formal wildlife training and had never been on a safari before this trip. Everything she knew about African wildlife came from what she had seen online. The version of Africa that exists on social media is curated, compressed, and stripped of consequence. It shows the golden hour and the elephant at sunrise. It does not show what moves through the grass after dark, or what happens when someone treats a wild landscape the same way they would treat a photo set. The first 2 days passed without incident. Madison photographed from the vehicle, but the results frustrated her. The animals were too far, the light too flat, the images too ordinary. By the second evening, she had begun pushing the guide, a local operator named Festus Ochieng, 46, to position the vehicle closer than standard practice allowed. Festus held firm on the core rules. No one exits the vehicle after dusk, no exceptions. I've seen this pattern before in my research, where someone with no real field experience starts treating a guide's instructions as suggestions rather than rules, and it almost always ends badly. What is worth understanding about Festus is that he was not being rigid for the sake of it. He had worked that conservancy for years. He knew what moved through the grass at dusk, and he knew that the rules he was enforcing were not arbitrary. They were written in the outcomes of situations exactly like this one. On the evening of October 3rd, the group stopped at an elevated ridge to watch the sunset. Madison wanted to frame herself against the horizon, standing outside the vehicle with the plains behind her. Festus refused. She waited until his attention shifted to another guest, then quietly stepped out, moving roughly 65 to 100 feet from the vehicle to find her angle. That distance sounds small, on open ground, at dusk, separated from the vehicle by a stretch of grass that anything could be moving through. It is not small at all. What she did not know was that a clan of spotted hyenas had been active in the area since late afternoon. A fresh kill had been reported near a watering hole less than a mile from the ridge earlier that day. Spotted hyenas are not the passive scavengers most people picture. They are highly efficient hunters, capable of sustaining speeds near 37 miles per hour over distance, with a bite force exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crush bone entirely. They are most active at dusk and dawn, and they are acutely sensitive to isolated movement on open ground. What I find particularly important to understand about hyenas is that a healthy, upright adult human near a vehicle is not a target they typically pursue, but a lone figure at distance, separated from any large object, moving unpredictably in fading light, is a completely different calculation for them. The vehicle matters. The group matters. The moment Madison stepped away from both, she changed what she looked like to everything watching from the grass. Madison was focused on her phone, adjusting her position against the fading light. She did not immediately notice the first animal emerge from the grass, roughly 80 feet to her left. It stopped and watched. Then a second appeared, further to her right, also stationary. Their low whooping calls carried across the ridge. Festus heard them from the vehicle and immediately looked toward Madison. He called out. She did not hear him or did not register the urgency in his voice. She saw the animals and froze. Then she turned and ran. This is the part that I think about every time I look at this case. Spotted. Hyenas have a well-documented chase response. A fleeing target triggers pursuit instinct in a way that a stationary one simply does not. Running was the worst possible reaction, and it sealed the outcome almost instantly. The nearest animal closed the distance within seconds, bit into her left calf, and pulled her down. It released and backed off briefly, still testing, but she was no longer upright, and that changed the dynamic entirely. A standing human registers differently than a human on the ground. Once she was down, the calculation shifted again. Festus was already driving toward her, horn blaring. The second animal moved in from the right. By the time the vehicle reached her position, Madison had sustained bites to her lower legs and one hand. Festus fired a warning shot, and the animals retreated into the grass. He got her into the vehicle and drove toward the Conservancy's airstrip. Madison remained conscious for the first several minutes, then went quiet from blood, loss, and shock. The wounds to her lower legs were severe. The femoral region of her left leg had been compromised, and bleeding could not be controlled in the field. She lost consciousness before the airstrip was reached. A medical team was waiting, but could not stabilize her. She was pronounced dead approximately 40 minutes after the attack. The incident was classified as a wildlife fatality. Festus was cleared of negligence. The hyenas were not destroyed. The Conservancy issued updated safety guidelines reinforcing the prohibition on exiting vehicles after 5 p.m. Madison's body was returned to Arizona. Her social media accounts remained active for several weeks before her family quietly archived them. The final post, uploaded the morning of October 3rd, showed the Kenyan plains at sunrise with a caption about chasing golden hour. She had been chasing it that evening too. She just did not understand what else was out there, chasing alongside her. The hyenas did not pursue her because she was there. They pursued her because she ran. That distinction is the part that is hardest to sit with. It was February 19th, 2014, at an aquarium facility in Savannah, Georgia, where a large open ocean exhibit was viewed through an underwater tunnel built into the public observation area. The tank contained multiple large marine predators under controlled environmental systems and routine safety protocols. Elvo Dantry was 29, from coastal Georgia, working in aquarium maintenance for just over a year. He held an associate degree in environmental science and was employed during a staffing shortage in a non-lead technical role. He was considered reliable and procedure-oriented, though not cleared for unsupervised high-risk dive entry. He was not scheduled for a solo maintenance dive that morning. That sentence is doing a lot of work. He wasn't supposed to be in that water. The main exhibit held approximately 280,000 gallons and contained 3 sand tiger sharks, a species generally considered low aggression toward divers in controlled aquarium settings, though activity levels can increase when feeding schedules are disrupted, especially in confined environments. That morning, feeding had been delayed due to internal scheduling changes. Staff logs noted elevated animal activity earlier in the day and recommended postponing any non-essential in-water work until feeding was completed and behavior stabilized. The advisory was not confirmed as acknowledged, and no physical dive lockout was in place at the entry point. A school group was present in the viewing tunnel beneath the tank, observing the exhibit as Elvo entered for what was intended to be a routine maintenance dive. Initial conditions inside the tank appeared stable. Water clarity was slightly reduced due to prior sediment disturbance, but visibility remained functional. Elvo began standard maintenance movements along the interior structure while monitoring shark spacing, which initially remained at a typical distance. As work continued, one shark moved in, closer than expected, and made direct contact with his arm. In confined aquarium environments, such contact is often classified as investigatory rather than predatory, but the force of the impact disrupted his balance against the acrylic boundary and caused immediate loss of tool control. Within seconds, additional close-range movement occurred in the same area of the tank as the other sharks adjusted position in response to the disturbance and shifting water pressure. Their movement remained consistent with reactive repositioning rather than coordinated aggression, but the confined environment reduced available escape space and amplified water displacement. This combination of limited maneuverability and disrupted orientation further compromised Elvo's ability to stabilize following the initial contact. Visibility degraded slightly as disturbed sediment and fine particulate matter spread through the water column near the tank floor. From the viewing tunnel, observers could see irregular movement patterns, but not clearly distinguish full detail of the interaction unfolding above. Surface staff recognized the escalation and initiated emergency response procedures, including immediate dive team activation and tank access coordination. A supervisor reached the entry point and entered the water to assist in controlled recovery as Elvo attempted to regain orientation and move toward the ascent area. Someone went in after him. I want you to hold on to that. However, his condition deteriorated rapidly following the initial high-force bite, which resulted in deep laceration and major vascular injury to the upper limb. Blood loss was immediate and significant, and combined with disorientation in the confined environment, his ability to stabilize and exit the water was compromised. Emergency extraction was completed, and Elvo was removed from the tank and transferred to on-site stabilization, where paramedics initiated hemorrhage control, fluid resuscitation, and airway management before rapid transport to hospital. Despite immediate surgical intervention, he died from exsanguination due to severe vascular injuries sustained in the tank. Medical documentation confirmed a primary deep bite-related laceration with associated vascular injury, consistent with high-force contact in a confined environment, leading to rapid and uncontrolled blood loss. Regulatory review found failures in buddy diving enforcement, hazard communication, and dive authorization during altered feeding conditions, resulting in fines and required safety revisions. It was August 14th, 2018. The northern sector of Kruger National Park lay under a dry, colorless sky when the stillness of a routine safari drive collapsed into a sequence of impacts. Leoren Vasca, known online as Leo, was 27 and had a small following built on low-budget travel across Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. He worked intermittently as a warehouse packer in Riga, saving for trips he framed as spontaneous and unscripted. Friends said he chased moments that could drive engagement, close calls, rule bending, anything that felt raw. His content relied less on expertise and more on proximity to risk and his willingness to dismiss it. He was traveling through South Africa with two acquaintances from a backpacking forum, Darvin Ilko, 25, from Bulgaria, and Simao Carrick, 29, from Portugal. Both ran small social media pages and shared Leo's approach to filming, often pushing each other to escalate situations for better footage. None had prior safari experience. Their guide, Mandla Nkub, had over a decade in the park and a reputation for strict safety. I think it was smart of them to hire an experienced guide. But knowing how this story ends, this detail makes this incident even more infuriating. By late morning, the group had seen little beyond distant herds and scattered antelope. According to Mandla, the monotony began to affect the passengers. Leo started filming from the back seat, narrating in a mocking tone about the lack of action. Darvin and Simao contributed intermittently, adding commentary and laughter. Mandla reminded them more than once to remain seated and to keep limbs inside the vehicle, emphasizing that proximity to wildlife did not equate to safety. I commend Mandla's patience. Personally, I would have dropped the gig then and there. He said that his instructions were acknowledged, but not followed consistently. Approximately an hour into the drive, they encountered a small grouping of elephants crossing the road ahead. A large bull stood several yards apart from the others, angled toward the vehicle. African bush elephants in this region are no joke. They can exceed 10 feet at the shoulder and weigh over 13,000 pounds, with mature bulls displaying unpredictable defensive behavior when separated from herds. Behavioral cues preceding a charge often include ear spreading, head elevation, and trunk curling inward, though these signals can escalate rapidly without prolonged display. Mandla immediately reduced speed and instructed the group to remain still and quiet. The tone inside the vehicle did not change. Leo continued filming, shifting his body for a clearer angle. He leaned his upper body out through the open side of the vehicle, extending past the frame while keeping one hand braced inside. Darvin leaned toward him to capture a similar shot, both of them focusing on the bull. Mandla's voice sharpened, directing Leo to sit down immediately. The instruction was repeated twice. Leo remained partially outside the vehicle, camera held forward. The bull elephant turned fully toward the vehicle, ears extending outward, trunk curling and uncurling in short movements. Dust lifted around its feet as it shifted its weight. The distance between the animal and the Jeep was under 40 yards. Just imagining the scene feels extremely terrifying. The charge began without further warning. The elephant accelerated directly toward the front left side of the vehicle, covering the distance in seconds. Witnesses in a trailing safari truck later described a sudden plume of dust and a rapid closing of space that left no time for repositioning. Mandla attempted to accelerate and angle the vehicle away, but the loose ground and proximity of the elephant prevented any meaningful movement. The impact was immediate. The elephant struck the Jeep's front left side, crushing metal and shoving it sideways. Leo, already off balance, was thrown about 6 feet from the vehicle, landing hard on his left side as his phone slid underneath. Inside, Darvin hit the side rail head first. Simao was pinned under the shifted seat, and Mandla was forced into the steering column with his lower body trapped. The elephant reached Leo within seconds. It struck him across the torso with its trunk, driving him into the ground. As he tried to pull himself forward, it brought a forefoot down onto his lower body, pinning him completely. Considering the weight of an average elephant, there's really no escaping death after being trampled by this massive animal. The animal lifted its foot briefly and repositioned. A second downward force was applied higher along the body, compressing the chest. Movement from Leo ceased at that point. The elephant remained over him for several seconds, shifting weight and pressing down again before stepping back. Dust hung in the air, partially obscuring visibility from the trailing vehicle. Inside the Jeep, Darvin was conscious, but disoriented, with visible bleeding from the scalp and limited ability to sit upright. Simao was similarly conscious, but unable to reposition himself due to compression against the seat frame. The fact that both remained conscious was actually surprising for me. Mandla, despite a visibly dislocated shoulder and his leg trapped beneath the dashboard, attempted repeatedly to restart the engine. He said his movements were uncoordinated and likely slowed by shock, and he was unable to regain control of the vehicle. The elephant turned its attention briefly toward the vehicle again, stepping closer before pausing. It faced the Jeep for several seconds, trunk moving across the ground near Leo's body before slowly backing away while maintaining orientation toward the disturbance. The distance increased gradually as the animal rejoined the direction of the herd. Mandla reached for the radio with his uninjured arm and initiated a call to park authorities. His transmission was fragmented, requiring multiple attempts to relay coordinates due to breath instability and pain. The trailing safari vehicle, positioned approximately 60 yards behind, had halted at the onset of the charge. Its occupants did not approach during the immediate aftermath due to the elephant's proximity. Within the disabled Jeep, Darvin's condition began to deteriorate. His responsiveness decreased, and his breathing became irregular. Simao remained intermittently conscious, but was unable to communicate clearly. Mandla continued attempting to stabilize the situation while maintaining radio contact. No one exited the vehicle. What's saddening for me is that the Rangers arrived approximately 22 minutes after the initial call. By that time, Leo showed no signs of life. Darvin had lost responsiveness during the final minutes before arrival. Simao was still alive, but unresponsive to verbal prompts and exhibiting shallow breathing. Extraction was conducted under controlled conditions. Once the area was confirmed clear of the elephant, all 3 victims were transported toward the nearest medical facility. Darvin was declared dead during transport after cardiac arrest approximately 10 minutes into evacuation. Simao's condition declined rapidly. He was pronounced dead shortly before arrival. Mandla was extracted alive, but with severe injuries, including a fractured leg and shoulder dislocation that limited mobility. Leo's and his friends' social media accounts remained active for several days before going silent and were eventually taken down by someone. But for me, the most frustrating part of this story isn't even who died. It's the situation of the survivor afterwards. Mandla underwent medical evaluation that confirmed long-term impairment to his leg and limited range of motion in his shoulder. He could not return to field guiding following the incident. His livelihood and future were just gone in an instant. It was November 7th, 2013, and the Warawat market in Chiang Mai, Thailand was already dense with vendors by mid-morning, except in one corner of the reptile section, where a 19-year-old lay, motionless on the ground, while the surrounding crowd pressed inward, and nobody knew what to do. Somchai Fan grew up 4 blocks from that market. He had enrolled the previous year, pursuing a biology degree. His professors described him as bright but unfocused, someone who could recite snake taxonomy, but struggled to finish a lecture without pulling out his phone. He had built a modest following on Facebook, posting close-range animal photographs, monitor lizards from river embankments, tokay geckos from neighborhood walls, and twice, pythons he had pulled from drainage channels near the market. His classmates found it impressive. His parents had asked him repeatedly to stop. He had come to Warorot that Thursday, specifically to photograph a king cobra that a vendor named Prathan had received 2 days earlier, kept discreetly in a reinforced wooden snake box near the back of his stall. Somchai was not there to buy it. Apparently, he wanted a close-range shot with his smartphone, ideally with his own face in the frame. King cobras are the longest venomous snakes on Earth, capable of reaching 18 feet and weighing up to 20 pounds. A single bite can deliver a large volume of neurotoxic venom, sometimes several hundred milligrams, with effects depending on how much is injected. The venom dismantles the nervous system systematically, targeting the muscles that control breathing, and eventually the heart. It does not cause dramatic convulsions. It causes a progressive, measurable shutdown. Prathan had secured the snake box and posted a handwritten note in Thai on the front. Do not open. He had sold reptiles for 11 years and kept king cobras twice before, always with locked enclosures and thick gloves within reach. That morning, he had warned 2 other visitors away from the box before Somchai arrived, and had stepped only a few meters away to speak with another seller. When Somchai crouched near the box around 10:40 a.m. and lifted the lid slightly, Prathan told him directly, in Thai, to step back. Imagine that. He was already warned, potentially saving his life, yet he still continued. A vendor at the adjacent stall echoed the warning. Somchai raised his phone, adjusted his angle, and leaned directly over the opening, bringing his upper body within a foot or two of the rim. The cobra struck upward from inside the opening, fangs making clean contact with Somchai's chest, left of center, through his shirt. The force pushed him back onto his heels, but did not put him on the ground immediately. Prathan, standing 3 feet away, later told police that within the first minute, Somchai's expression shifted from focused to strained, his eyes blinking more slowly and his mouth tightening as if he were trying to speak but could not. Somchai remained upright for a moment before sitting down on the ground. Over the next several minutes, a faint trembling appeared in his hands. His eyelids began to droop and his head started to lose support at the neck, forcing him to tilt it slightly back. Prathan came around the counter and moved him away from the box, laying him flat in the shade of the adjacent canopy. Somchai's chest was still rising, but each breath was shorter than the one before it. By approximately 15 minutes, his eyes were open and struggling to stay focused. His mouth had gone slack. His fingers had slowed to minimal movement. A faint bluish tint began to appear around his lips as his breathing weakened. By 30 minutes, he was making only shallow, infrequent attempts to breathe. Bystanders attempted to tilt his head back to open his airway and fanned his face. One man poured water on his forehead. Another bystander tried to wrap cloth around his upper torso in an attempt to slow the spread of venom, though it had no effect. None of it addressed what was systematically happening inside him. Prathan called the emergency line at approximately 10:47 a.m. Responders arrived at 11:26, roughly 40 minutes. After the strike, Somchai was unresponsive, with no spontaneous respiration, despite basic airway support administered on scene. The coroner's summary noted cause of death as respiratory paralysis, secondary to neurotoxic envenomation. No significant wound laceration was found on external examination. The fangs had punctured cleanly and closed. Time of death was estimated between 11:10 and 11:30 a.m. Somchai's parents collected his belongings from the university the following week. I don't know what's more baffling, that Somchai ignored a handwritten warning, a verbal warning from the vendor, and another warning from a neighboring stall, all to lean his face and chest directly over an open snake box holding a king cobra for a selfie. It was October 17, 2018, in the Limpopo region of South Africa. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, and the light over the dry grassland had turned orange and flat. The heat had been sitting over the reserve all day, and even at this hour, it had not let go. The safari vehicle moved slowly along the track, dust rising behind it, the guide keeping the engine low as the Pride came into view beneath a cluster of scattered trees. Rafael Duarte, 23, was a Brazilian TikToker whose online presence had started 2 years earlier with a video filmed in a beach parking lot at night after his girlfriend left him for a local gym instructor. He had paced in front of the camera, ranting about fearlessness and what women respected in men. The video spread because people found it funny. He had not intended to become a minor internet personality, and he had not intended to become a joke, but both things happened at once. He rebuilt his identity around appearing fearless, climbing unfinished buildings, entering abandoned sites, filming dares, but the engagement was dropping, and he needed something that would work. The guide briefed the group before the vehicle entered the reserve. Stay inside at all times. Lions are accustomed to vehicles, but not to people on foot. Do not open doors. Rafael listened the way he listened to most safety instructions. That line told me everything I needed to know about what was coming next. The vehicle stopped around 60 feet from the Pride. 3 lions were resting in the shade, tails flicking slowly, bodies relaxed. Other tourists were filming quietly. Rafael watched through his camera and decided it was not enough. The footage looked calm and still, and there was nothing in it that would restore the attention he had been losing for months. He waited until the guide turned to answer a question from another passenger. He opened the side door quietly, stepped out onto the track, and walked several feet from the vehicle with his action camera running. The lions did not move immediately. Rafael recorded himself standing outside the vehicle, commenting on the tourists inside, comparing himself to survival personalities. The lack of immediate reaction confirmed something in his mind that had been confirmed by every previous stunt that had not ended badly. Nothing had moved yet. He was still in control. This is where things went wrong for me reading this. He read the lion not reacting as proof he was safe. That is the last mistake he made. One lion lifted its head. It fixed its gaze on Rafael and held it there. Several seconds passed. Then, the animal rose slowly from its resting position. Its posture shifted. Its movement became deliberate. It began a slow forward advance through the dry grass, eyes locked on Rafael, closing the distance without hurrying. The guide saw Rafael outside the vehicle and began shouting immediately. He revved the engine and ordered everyone to stay seated. Rafael heard the shouting and saw the lion moving and understood that the situation had changed. He did not know whether moving suddenly would trigger a faster response. He hesitated. The lion did not hesitate. It lowered its body into a stalking posture and kept coming. Rafael started stepping backward toward the vehicle. His feet caught on the uneven ground and scattered brush along the track edge. He was watching the lion, listening to the guide, trying to keep the camera steady, and trying to find his footing all at the same time. He stumbled. The lion accelerated. It covered the remaining distance in seconds. Rafael was beside the safari track when it reached him, too far from the vehicle door to get back inside. The lion took him down with the full force of its weight behind the strike, driving him to the ground. The bite closed on his shoulder and upper chest. The animal's canines punctured deep into muscle and tissue, and one tooth caught along the right side of his neck, creating a laceration across the sternocleidomastoid muscle and partially severing the right external carotid artery. The injury was severe, and bleeding was immediate and heavy, but the left carotid remained intact. Rafael lost consciousness from acute blood loss, but remained alive. The guide and remaining staff initiated emergency response procedures immediately, using the vehicle and noise to push the animal back. Emergency services were contacted, and Rafael was airlifted to a hospital in the nearest city. Surgeons worked to address the vascular damage to his neck and shoulder, attempting to repair the severed artery and control the hemorrhage. The surgical team stabilized the vascular injury, but infection set in rapidly during recovery. Sepsis developed within hours and progressed despite aggressive antibiotic intervention and repeat procedures. Rafael died in hospital 68 hours after the attack. The cause of death was recorded as septic shock, secondary to deep cervical laceration with vascular injury, consistent with a large felid attack. Investigators confirmed he had exited the vehicle voluntarily after receiving clear safety instructions. It was June 14, 2016, outside Cody, Wyoming. where the Absaroka Range cuts into the sky like broken teeth and the wind carries the smell of pine and something older. The kind of country that doesn't negotiate. Evan James Mallory, 31, worked IT support for a mid-sized logistics company in Boise, Idaho. He was the guy who fixed your printer and quietly resented it. What gave him purpose was the Pacific Northwest LARP community, where he played a druid named Calden Moore, the Patient. He was respected in that world, a scene coordinator, a lore keeper, someone people listened to. He'd driven 9 hours to attend the Renaissance Fair near Cody with his girlfriend, Priya Nath. The fair was incidental. For Evan, the Absaroka backcountry was the real draw. Priya later said that he'd mentioned more than once that getting into character meant getting into nature. The trail they took climbed a sagebrush slope above the Shoshone River Basin, opening into a subalpine clearing roughly 2 miles from the trailhead. Grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem are not rare. Population estimates in 2016 placed over 700 animals in the region. Adult males average 400 to 600 pounds and can sprint 35 miles per hour. Their charge response can be triggered by sudden arm movement, direct eye contact, or perceived advance into their space. Bears in early summer are calorie deficient after hibernation, which elevates aggression. A trail information board at the trailhead posted an active bear warning, recent grizzly sightings within a mile of the area. A ranger had also verbally flagged it to fair attendees that morning. Priya later told investigators she remembered seeing the sign. She also said Evan had pointed up the ridge and said something to the effect that the bear was far enough and that he wanted to see how close he could get before it moved off. He carried bear spray clipped to his satchel. She stayed back. Evan moved upslope toward the ridge. The bear, an adult male, was roughly 80 yards out but already moving along the tree line and slowly closing distance toward the same drainage, feeding and drifting between brush patches. By the time Evan stopped, the space between them had narrowed to about 40 yards, with the bear now fully aware of their presence. Evan raised his staff with one arm extended wide, a gesture pulled from his LARP lexicon, meant to signal peaceful intent. The sudden arm movement likely contributed to the bear's shift in attention. The bear stopped feeding. What happened next took under 6 seconds. The grizzly dropped its head and came straight downhill. Evan reached behind his back for the bear spray. The wind was blowing toward him at roughly 10 miles per hour. He discharged the canister only when the bear had closed to roughly 25 feet. The spray blew back directly into his face at close range. He went down immediately, partially blinded and choking. The staff fell. The bear did not slow. The first contact knocked Evan backward onto the slope. The bear bit into his left shoulder and shook, dislocating the joint and fracturing the clavicle before shifting its attention higher toward his head. Priya ran downhill screaming. A day hiker lower on the trail heard her and called 911. Terrain delayed emergency response to approximately 32 minutes. Mallory was pronounced dead at the scene by rescue personnel after a brief field assessment. Within the LARP community, Evan's death prompted a brief wave of posts and tribute sessions where participants shared memories of his character work and coordination efforts. An in-character memorial event was held in his honor, but the discussion surrounding the incident quickly shifted toward safety boundaries. In outdoor roleplay settings, I don't mock Evan Mallory. He was someone who built meaning through imagination, and that's not a character flaw, but imagination has no authority over 500 pounds of bear. The costume, the staff, the gesture, none of it meant anything to the animal coming down that ridge. It never does. It was July 22nd, 2016, right in the middle of a Florida summer. And if you've ever heard anything about Florida, you already know the wildlife doesn't exactly chill out during this time. If anything, it gets more active, more aggressive. So hearing that a group of guys decided to camp near a remote canal at night, yeah, that already sounds like the start of a bad idea. Kian Vasquez was 28, a construction worker who had just moved to Tampa from Arizona about 6 months earlier. And I kinda get it. If you grow up somewhere dry, where the most dangerous thing you deal with is maybe a rattlesnake, it's easy to underestimate how different Florida is. But still, I feel like at some point you'd at least ask someone, right? Especially when locals literally treat certain areas like no-go zones after dark. Kian had this reputation for being fearless, but honestly, it sounds more like he just didn't know where the line was. You know those people who always take things one step further than everyone else, just to prove they can? Yeah, that kind of energy. That night, he and a group of co-workers had just wrapped up a long week and decided to camp near one of these canals. They'd been drinking for hours, and you can probably already imagine how the mood shifted. Jokes getting louder, dares getting thrown around, people trying to outdo each other. Then someone spots a pair of glowing red eyes in the water, and I don't know about you, but that's the exact moment I'm calling it a night. No hesitation. But instead, it turns into a challenge. Who's brave enough to get closer? Kian takes it personally. He starts talking about how he's not afraid of any reptile, brushing it off like it's nothing. At first, his friends are laughing, but you can tell it slowly turns into concern when he actually starts taking off his clothes and stepping toward the water. He strips down to his boxers and walks straight into the canal. Almost immediately, the alligator strikes. No warning, no buildup, just pure speed. It lunges from the darkness, clamps onto his upper thigh, and starts a death roll. It's violent, disorienting, and over in seconds. Then, just as quickly, it lets go, which, honestly, feels like the only lucky break he got that entire night. The noise from the shoreline probably scared it off, and Kian manages to stumble back out of the water. He's bleeding, clearly injured, but he's conscious, alive. His friends rush in, drag him out, panicking, but also probably thinking the worst is over. And here's where things take a turn that's honestly more frustrating than the attack itself. Because Kian starts joking. He downplays it, acts like it's not a big deal, like he just got lucky, and that's the end of it. He wraps his leg in a dirty shirt and insists he doesn't need a hospital. His friends tell him to get medical help. He refuses. And I keep thinking, was it pride, embarrassment, not wanting to admit he took it too far? Because that one decision, that's really what sealed everything. Over the next couple of days, his condition gets worse. The swelling increases, the skin changes color, the pain intensifies. What probably looked like just a bite starts turning into something way more serious. Infections from alligator bites are no joke. The bacteria in their mouths can spread fast, and in his case, it turns into severe cellulitis. By day 3, it's already bad. By day 4, it's critical. The infection enters his bloodstream, and he develops sepsis, his body basically going into full system failure trying to fight it off. He collapses in his apartment, and by the time paramedics arrive, there's nothing they can do. The medical examiner later confirmed it. Septic shock from an untreated alligator bite. And what really sticks with me here is how preventable it was. Antibiotics, proper wound care, even just going to the hospital that same night could have changed everything. It was June 14th, 2017, Elphinstone Reef, Egyptian Red Sea. An open water shark dive operating at a remote offshore site known for reliable encounters with the oceanic white-tip shark. The dive was conducted under direct supervision, with guides in the water. Multiple sharks were present from the start of the session. One large oceanic white-tip, estimated at around 9 to 10 feet, had been circling at a distance since the group entered. The water. Blaine Carter was 28. He ran a social media page built around close wildlife footage and had around 6,000 followers. Every trip he took was content. Every dive was an opportunity to come back with something that would perform well and grow the page. He had paid approximately $4,000 for this dive and had told his followers before leaving that he would return with clear shark footage. The helmet-mounted GoPro he wore into the water was not just equipment, it was the whole point of being there. Before entry, the dive guides ran a full briefing. The rules were specific to the environment. Maintain a stable position. Do not reach toward sharks or any objects in the water. Do not pursue drifting equipment. Keep all movements controlled and deliberate. Oceanic whitetips were described during the briefing as slow-moving animals capable of sudden acceleration and highly responsive to erratic or uncontrolled movement in open water. Blaine heard the briefing and entered the water. The first portion of the dive went without incident. The sharks were present and moving at distance. Blaine was recording. The large white tip continued its wide circle around the group. Nothing happened that was outside the expected parameters of the dive. At some point during the session, the mount holding the GoPro to Blaine's helmet failed. The mount had not been secured with a secondary tether, and when the fitting gave way, the camera detached and drifted away from him in open water. He watched it move out of reach. Everything he had filmed was on that camera. He had paid $4,000 for the trip, told his audience he was coming back with footage, and the only record of the dive was now floating away from him. He moved toward the camera. He extended both arms out in front of him to reach it and grab it back. Sometimes I wonder why people think the rules exist. The briefing had said it directly. Do not pursue drifting equipment. He had heard it 40 minutes earlier. The camera drifted, and he went for it anyway. The movement was wide, sudden, and uncontrolled. Both arms extended away from his body in open water, with a species briefed specifically as reactive to exactly that kind of stimulus. The guides were positioned several meters away, managing the rest of the group, and could not reach him before the situation developed. He got his hands on the camera. As he pulled back, his posture was still off balance, both arms still extended and away from his body. His attention divided between the camera and reorienting himself. The white tip accelerated from its position and closed the distance. The bite landed on the exposed arm during the recovery phase, single and rapid. The animal disengaged immediately, consistent with investigative bite behavior in the species. The forearm sustained severe vascular damage. The brachial artery was compromised, and blood loss was significant from the first moment. The guides reached him and got him out of the water and onto the vessel as fast as they could manage. Survival depended on rapid surgical intervention that was not achievable in the time available. The vessel turned for shore and emergency services were contacted. Blaine Carter died before reaching land. He was 28 years old. Post-incident review confirmed that Blaine had pursued drifting equipment in direct violation of the briefing, that both arms had been extended away from his body during the recovery attempt, and that his posture at the point of contact was unstable and uncontrolled. Shark behavior was assessed as a typical investigative response to erratic movement in open water. The GoPro was never recovered. No footage from the dive existed. The dive operation reviewed its equipment protocols and subsequently required all participant cameras to be secured with a secondary tether before entry. He went in for footage and came out with nothing. And the part I find tragic is that he paid with his life.